There is a particular kind of silence, a really distinct quiet that falls when you are confronted with a truly monumental piece of architecture. You know the feeling. You step inside a centuries-old cathedral, the heavy wooden doors close behind you, and suddenly you're enveloped in a structure so vast, so intricately designed, that it demands total stillness just to comprehend the space you were standing in.
It forces a kind of reverence.
Exactly. And we are stepping into that exact kind of intellectual silence right now as we open Immanuel Kant's 1788 masterwork, The Critique of Practical Reason. The mission of our conversation today is to map every single corridor of this incredible text, to unpack the dense architecture of Kant's mind and to understand exactly how he redefined human morality.
It is such a massive undertaking, but so rewarding.
It really is. This is the second of his three magnificent critiques, and you can really think of the book as the birthplace of German idealism. It is a text that completely rewired the landscape of moral philosophy and deeply influenced thinkers who followed him, like Johann Gottlieb Fichte. But to truly grasp what is happening in these pages, we have to sit quietly with the pivot Kant makes from his first critique.
Right, the shift from theoretical to practical.
Yeah. If theoretical reason, which he tackled first, is like a heavy brass telescope designed strictly to map the physical observable universe, then practical reason is an internal compass. The telescope has to be strictly restrained. The moment it tries to look past the physical universe into the metaphysical, it produces blurry, confused illusions. But the internal compass, the one dictating moral action, that is an entirely different instrument altogether.
It is a completely different instrument, and that distinction is the very pulse of the book. And what is fascinating, if we look closely at the title, you might logically expect, given the title of his previous work, that this would be called The Critique of Pure Practical Reason.
Because the first one was The Critique of Pure Reason.
Precisely. But Kant is very deliberate here. He intentionally omits the word pure from the title. And the reason is profoundly elegant in its simplicity. He is not critiquing pure practical reason at all. Pure practical reason does not need to be restrained or audited or held back. It proves its own reality simply by existing and generating moral action. What actually requires a critique, what must be carefully, almost surgically dismantled and examined, is applied practical reason.
You mean the reasoning that is tangled up in our everyday desires? I mean our impulses, our self-interest.
Exactly that. Pure practical reason must be cultivated and allowed to flourish, while the pretensions of our desire-based applied reasoning are what must be kept in check. Applied practical reason is constantly trying to convince us that our selfish desires are actually universal moral laws. Kant is trying to quiet that noise so we can actually hear the pure compass.
And listening to that compass brings us to one of the most striking, almost startling revelations in the book. If you read the first critique, you leave with a distinct impression that true freedom is just a theoretical loophole. It felt like a possibility that merely keeps us from falling into total, despairing skepticism, but ultimately something completely unknowable through the telescope.
Yes, a placeholder almost.
Right. But here, in the quiet, rigorous space of this second critique, the book insists that freedom is fundamentally, undeniably knowable. It is not a guess. It is a fact, laid bare by the existence of the moral law within us.
Think of it as the keystone in a grand, soaring archway of pure reason. In architectural terms, the keystone is that wedge-shaped stone at the very apex of a masonry arch. It is the final piece placed during construction, and the moment it locks into position, the entire cathedral can bear its own weight. Without it, the whole structure just collapses into dust. For Kant, the reality of freedom is that keystone. It is proven by what he calls the apodeictic law of practical reason.
Apodeictic meaning unconditionally necessary, an undeniable, absolute imperative.
Precisely. It is the only idea of pure reason whose possibility we know a priori before any experience, simply because it is the necessary condition for the moral law. We experience the moral law weighing on our conscience, therefore freedom must be real. If we weren't free, we couldn't feel the weight of moral obligation, the arch holds.
But wait, this is where I find myself, and probably you listening at home, furrowing our brows a bit. Because what is so fascinating is how other massive concepts that seemed entirely out of reach when we were just looking through the telescope, suddenly find their place once that keystone of freedom is locked in. Specifically, I'm talking about the concepts of God and immortality.
Ah, yes, the postulates.
Right, because in the theoretical realm, Kant famously dismantled the traditional proofs for God's existence. He took apart the ontological, the cosmological, and the teleological proofs.
And just to briefly demystify those for a moment, the ontological proof tries to define God into existence. arguing that a perfect being must exist because existence is a perfection. The cosmological proof argues that there must be a first cause to the universe, and that cause is God. And the teleological proof is the intelligent design argument, the idea that the complexity of the universe requires a grand watchmaker. Kant systematically dismantled all three, famously arguing that existence is not a predicate. You cannot just attach existence to a concept to make it real.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have to be very clear here, looking at this strictly and impartially as the philosophical architecture of the book. Kant is not making a theological declaration of faith here. He is explaining the structural mechanics of human reason. But my question is, isn't it a bit of a cop-out for Kant? I mean, he says we can't prove God with a telescope, but then he turns around and says our internal compass demands we believe in God and immortality. How does he justify that leap without it sounding like he's just sneaking his own preferences in through the back door?
It is a brilliant question, and it is exactly what makes his use of the word postulate so critical. He is completely severing these concepts from theoretical proof. You cannot point the telescope at the night sky and find God or the immortal soul. But practical reason, the compass, demands that we assume them as postulates. Now, a Kantian postulate is not like a postulate in pure mathematics.
How so?
Well, in geometry, a postulate carries absolute theoretical certainty. But a postulate of pure practical reason is a necessary subjective hypothesis. We are structurally compelled to believe in God and immortality, not because we can prove them as objective facts of the universe, but because they are the absolute prerequisites for achieving what Kant calls the summum bonum.
The highest good. The ultimate perfect alignment where a person possesses complete moral virtue and is also granted perfect happiness to match that virtue. Which, if we look around at the physical, causal world we live in, doing the right thing almost never guarantees happiness.
Almost never.
Think about it. Think about a whistleblower in a massive corporation who risks their entire career to expose corruption. Doing their duty costs them their livelihood, their reputation, sometimes everything. Nature does not reward virtue with happiness. In fact, it often punishes it.
Which is exactly why reason inevitably demands an eternal horizon. It demands immortality so that the soul has infinite time to achieve perfect virtue. And it demands a supreme moral cause, God, capable of perfectly aligning that hard-won virtue with proportionate happiness in a way that blind physical nature simply refuses to do. These are conditions of the practical use of our pure reason.
We don't theoretically understand them.
Right, but their possibility is proven because freedom actually exists. They attach themselves to that keystone of freedom. The subjective necessity of these ideas has the binding force of law. Without them, the ultimate aim of our moral action becomes a literal impossibility, and reason would be asking us to pursue a phantom.
And Kant practically dares anyone to prove otherwise. The book issues this quiet, ironclad challenge to his critics, the ones boasting that they possess high theoretical knowledge of the supersensible. He quotes a Latin phrase, quid status, effectively saying, why do you stand there? If you have this proof, step forward and exhibit it publicly. Let it be tested. The critical philosophy lays its arms at your feet.
But they don't because they can't.
Exactly. So we are forced to take up the tools of the moral use of reason, which leads to what Kant acknowledges as the great enigma of his critical philosophy. How can we possibly deny the reality of things beyond our physical senses in theory, but completely embrace them in practice?
It is the paradox that has haunted so many readers of the book, but the resolution Kant provides is breathtaking in its symmetry. It requires us to understand the profound dual nature of humanity, the absolute necessity of viewing ourselves from two entirely different vantage points simultaneously. Imagine a coin spinning silently on a dark mahogany table.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
While it spins, it is a single, unified object, but it possesses two distinct faces that represent entirely different realities. On one side, humans are phenomena. We are physical entities, bound completely and utterly by the strict mechanical laws of nature, the relentless chain of cause and effect in empirical consciousness.
Biology, physics, chemistry, every physical action has a physical cause. But on the flip side of that spinning coin, in the quiet, purely internal space of our own pure consciousness, we are noumena. We are things in ourselves, independent of physical time and space, existing as free moral agents capable of initiating an entirely new chain of causality.
Exactly. And this is not a contradiction. It is a necessary harmonious duality. If we do not conceive of humanity in this dual sense as a phenomenon in empirical consciousness and a noumenon in pure consciousness, reason inevitably fractures and contradicts itself.
Because if we were only phenomena,
Freedom would be a physical impossibility. It would just be a hallucination of the mind, and moral responsibility would vanish into biological mechanism. The moral law absolutely requires this noumenal existence to function. We must be authors of our actions in the noumenal realm to be held responsible for them in the phenomenal realm.
this structural elegance is mirrored in the very anatomy of the book itself. Kant maps the second critique precisely alongside the first. You have the analytic, which investigates exactly how this faculty of pure practical reason operates, breaking down its principles, the objects of pure practical reason, and the motives driving it. Then you have the dialectic, which acts as a map of all the illusions and traps that can lead practical reason astray when it tries to overstep its bounds. But it is the final section, the doctrine of method, where the atmosphere shifts into something deeply applicable to lived human experience.
Yes, the doctrine of method here is fundamentally different from its counterpart in the first critique. There, it was about outlining the scientific study of theoretical principles, drawing boundaries around what we can know. Here, it is about moral education. It is answering the most urgent human question: how do we actually bring the rigid, pristine principles of practical reason into the messy, complicated reality of human behavior?
How to make people act morally, not just by accident or for a reward, but fundamentally from the core of their being. And that brings us to the cynic's ultimate question. The utilitarian observer looks at humanity and asks, can a person ever truly act purely out of an obligation to duty? Can we ever sever our actions entirely from self-interest, from the desire for praise or comfort or survival? Imagine a grand, opulent masquerade ball. Everyone is dressed flawlessly, bowing politely, speaking with absolute civility, never stepping out of line. It looks like a perfectly moral society. Think about your own workplace or even your social media feed. Everyone curating this image of perfect, polite, ethical behavior. How much of that politeness is just the masquerade ball Kant is talking about?
That is the perfect modern parallel. Kant warns us that without the correct inner motivation, the pure respect for the moral law itself, that beautiful masquerade ball, your perfectly polite workplace, is nothing more than a fragile theater of hypocrisy. If everyone is only acting politely because it benefits their reputation, or because they fear HR reprimands, or because it brings them a fleeting feeling of pleasure and validation, then the moment those external advantages vanish, the masks drop. A society built merely on the outward show of morality is inherently unstable. It is heavily dependent on circumstantial advantage and selfish gain.
It is a chilling thought that we could build an entire civilization that looks perfectly moral on the surface, but is actually entirely void of true ethical substance inward. But the book doesn't leave us in that cynical despair. Kant is utterly convinced that human beings possess the capacity for true, duty-bound moral behavior. He reassures us that we can transcend the theater of hypocrisy. He believes that humanity is capable of replacing the shifting sands of superstition and temporary advantage with a rigorous, reliable science of ethics.
And this rigorous science requires incredible precision, which is why Kant is so meticulous in defending the book against its critics. There was a reviewer who sought to find fault with the work by accusing Kant of offering no new principle of morality, only a new formula. Kant's response is brilliant in its calm authority. He doesn't deny it, he embraces it. Who, he asks, would dare claim to invent a brand new principle of morality, as if the entire human race had been completely ignorant of duty and wallowing in error until now?
It's like a mathematician offering a new formula. The mathematician didn't invent the concept of mathematics or the reality of numbers, but a new mathematical formula is monumental. It defines accurately what must be done to work a problem. It provides an infallible tool to solve equations that previously left people confused and stumbling in the dark. Kant's formulation of duty is exactly that kind of monumental tool for the human conscience.
But to forge that tool, the book insists on a vocabulary stripped of all empirical baggage. Kant refuses to borrow definitions casually from the psychology of his day. And this is where his writing can feel a bit impenetrable, but it is deeply intentional. Let's look at how he defines three core concepts: life, the faculty of desire, and pleasure. In the text, he defines life strictly as the faculty a being has of acting according to the laws of the faculty of desire.
Which sounds incredibly sterile, right? It almost sounds like a textbook.
Yeah.
But if we break that down, he's basically saying life isn't about having a biological heartbeat or dividing cells.
Yeah.
He's defining life as having agency. It's the ability to actually act on what you want.
Exactly. And then he defines desire as a being's faculty of becoming, by means of its ideas, the cause of the actual existence of the objects of those ideas.
So in plain English, desire isn't just a craving. It's the mental power to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, and then cause it to exist in the real world. You picture a painting, you desire to make it, and your action brings that painting into reality.
Precisely. And finally, he defines pleasure as the idea of the agreement of the object with the subjective conditions of life.
Meaning, pleasure is just the subjective feeling you get when the world happens to align with what you personally want. Now, why does he go out of his way to define these things so clinically? He is deliberately keeping them strictly a priori, built only from categories of pure understanding, containing absolutely nothing empirical.
It is a profound protective measure. If he allowed empirical psychology to define those terms, he would be smuggling in the assumption that all human desire is ultimately based on the pursuit of a feeling of pleasure. By defining them strictly through pure categories, he intentionally leaves the contested point open. This allows him to prove later that practical reason can determine the will entirely independent of any physical pleasure or pain. It is an act of extreme philosophical discipline, ensuring the foundation of ethics is not compromised by subjective feelings.
You see that exact same discipline in his linguistic nuances, specifically when he talks about what is permitted and forbidden versus what is duty and contrary to duty. In everyday conversation, we use those terms almost interchangeably. We say, "You are forbidden from parking here," or "It is my duty to go to the grocery store." But Kant draws a sharp, unforgiving line between them. The permitted and forbidden apply only to problematical, practical precepts. If you are solving a geometry problem, you are forbidden from drawing a three-sided square.
Though human stubbornness will certainly try to invent one, inevitably failing against the rules of logic. If you are an orator, it is forbidden to invent completely nonsensical words if you want to be understood, though a poet might be permitted to do so. But the key here is that no one is morally obligated to be a geometer or an orator. If you want to forfeit your reputation as a public speaker by speaking gibberish, no one can prevent you. It is merely a technical rule.
Duty, however, applies to an actual law present in reason. It is not problematical. It is apodeictic, unconditionally necessary. You don't have a choice to opt out of the moral law the way you can opt out of the rules of poetry. This distinction is vital because it protects the absolute authority of the moral law from being confused with mere technical rules or hypothetical advice. It ensures we understand the absolute weight of what is being demanded of us.
Which perfectly sets up the final, perhaps most profound argument in the book regarding the absolute necessity of a priori knowledge. If we try to build our morality on the foundation of human experience, on watching what people do and trying to extract a universal rule from it, Kant uses this incredibly vivid, visceral imagery. He says it is like trying to squeeze water from a pumice stone, ex pumice aquam. You can squeeze until your hands bleed, but true, universal necessity will never flow from mere observation of the physical world.
Because experience can only ever tell us what is, or what has been. It can never tell us what absolutely must be. If we abandon the a priori, if we reject the idea that reason provides its own pure concepts completely independent of experience, we degrade the very nature of human intellect. We reduce ourselves to the level of animals relying on mere expectation.
Think about a dog. A dog experiences an event repeatedly, you picking up a leash, and develops a custom, a habit of expecting a walk. If we replace objective, rational necessity with subjective custom, we are simply animals anticipating the future based on the past. We deny reason the power of truly knowing anything, and we obliterate the possibility of binding ourselves to a universal moral law. We are just reacting to stimuli.
And as we sit here in the stillness of this architectural marvel Kant has built, I want you to hold on to that thought, but take it one step further into the world we live in today. Kant fought so hard to prove our noumenal freedom, to separate us from the mere animal habit of cause and effect. But look around us now. We live in an era defined by modern neuroscience, mapping every synapse, and predictive algorithms anticipating our desires before we even register them. If a machine can predict what you will buy, what you will click, and how you will vote based entirely on your past phenomenal habits, where does that leave that quiet, rigid architecture of pure freedom? If we are truly free, uncaused moral agents in our inner consciousness, how do we reconcile that with a digital world that treats us entirely as predictable, mechanical phenomena? Which brings us seamlessly right into the very heart of Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason.
It does.
And as we transition into this next section of the book, we're really stepping away from the realm of the purely theoretical. We're entering a space that directly examines the mechanics of human agency.
A very quiet but monumental shift.
Exactly. Our objective for this segment of our exploration is quite specific for you. we are going to calmly investigate how human reason governs our actions. We need to parse out the fundamental difference between our subjective desires and universal laws, and ultimately attempt to uncover what it truly means to possess a free will.
It is a profound philosophical shift. To set the stage for you, we really have to recognize the distinction the text makes right away. The theoretical use of reason, which we explored previously, was concerned entirely with understanding objects.
Right, making sense of the world we see.
Exactly. And as the argument points out, when reason applies itself merely to theoretical cognition, it can sometimes lose itself among unattainable objects or contradictory notions. It reaches beyond its limits. But the practical use of reason is fundamentally different. Here, reason is concerned not with external objects, but with the grounds of determination of the will.
The will. That really is the focal point here. The text defines the will as a faculty, either to produce objects corresponding to ideas or, and this is key, to determine ourselves to affect such objects.
To determine our own causality.
Yes. So the central question that anchors this entire section is basically this. Can pure reason alone determine our actions? Or are we simply guided, perhaps even entirely enslaved, by our worldly experiences, our physical conditions, and our desires?
To approach that question gently, the text asks us to look at the philosophy of David Hume, specifically his system of universal empiricism. The book offers a very calm but thoroughly devastating critique of Hume's approach.
Because Hume wanted to strip the concept of cause of any objective necessity, right?
He did. He wanted to reduce causality to something merely subjective. He called it custom.
And the reasoning behind that is quite revealing. By reducing cause and effect to mere habit or custom, derived from experience, Hume sought to deny that reason could make any valid judgments about concepts that exist beyond our physical senses.
Concepts like God, freedom, immortality.
Precisely. If everything we know is just a habit born of sensory experience, then pure reason has absolutely no authority to speak on anything that cannot be physically touched or seen.
It is a bold claim. However, the text points out a fascinating contradiction in Hume's logic. If we were to apply this universal empiricism to absolutely everything, it would have to include mathematics.
Right, which is a problem for empiricists.
A massive problem. Now, Hume tried to avoid this by claiming mathematical principles were purely analytical and separate from experience. But the argument here suggests that if you adopt universal empiricism as your sole foundation of knowledge, mathematics is inevitably drawn in.
You can't just wall it off.
You really can't. And when you force a science as exact as mathematics into a framework that only admits empirical principles derived from sensory habits, you encounter severe logical clashes.
There is a very precise example used in the book to illustrate this clash. It's the antinomy involving the infinite divisibility of space.
Oh, that's a brilliant example.
It is. And for you listening, an antinomy is essentially a paradox. It's a situation where two perfectly logical principles contradict each other. Mathematics proves the infinite divisibility of space through rigorous demonstration.
But empiricism simply cannot admit it.
Exactly, because human beings cannot empirically experience infinity. We cannot physically see or feel something divided infinitely. So you have the greatest possible evidence of mathematical demonstration in direct contradiction with alleged conclusions from sensory experience.
It leaves the mind in a state of quiet crisis. The text uses a really striking analogy here, referencing Cheselden's blind patient.
I love that analogy.
It's so visceral. When a patient who has been blind suddenly gains their sight, and their new visual experiences contradict their familiar tactile experiences, they ask, which deceives me, sight or touch?
They're completely disoriented.
Completely. And in the same way, when empiricism and rationalism clash over a concept like infinite divisibility, we are left totally disoriented. This happens because empiricism is based on a necessity that is merely felt through habit, while rationalism is based on a necessity that is seen and verified by the mind.
The conclusion drawn from this disorientation is uncompromising. Universal empiricism, if taken to its logical end, reveals itself as absolute skepticism.
It leaves us with nothing.
No certain touchstone for truth at all. And so, recognizing the inadequacy of mere empirical feelings, the argument returns to the necessity of rational a priori principles, knowledge independent of experience, to guide the will.
Which brings us to the actual structure of practical reason as laid out in the text. If you are paying close attention to the architecture of the book, you might notice something highly unusual.
The reversal.
Yes. The order of the analysis here is exactly the reverse of how it was structured in the Critique of Pure Theoretical Reason.
And that feels incredibly counterintuitive at first glance. Usually we start with what we can see and feel, the senses, Then we move to concepts, and we build our abstract principles from there. Why reverse the architecture entirely and start with abstract principles?
There's a very specific, deeply elegant reason for this reversed architecture. In this case, we are not dealing with reason in relation to external objects that we can sense. We are dealing with a will.
Something internal.
Exactly. More specifically, we're trying to establish the principles of a causality that is not empirically conditioned. That unconditioned causality is freedom.
Yeah.
Because we are starting with the law of causality from freedom, which is a pure practical principle, we must begin with the principles themselves. Only after establishing those pure principles can we attempt to apply them to concepts, to objects, and lastly, to the human subject and our sensory faculties.
It is a structure built on the assumption that pure reason can be entirely self-sufficient in determining our actions. So let's examine these principles. The text categorizes these practical principles into two distinct types. The first are what it calls maxims.
Maxims are subjective. They are rules a person makes that are valid only for their own individual will. Imagine someone makes it their personal rule to let no injury pass unrevenged.
A grudge holder.
Right, that is a maxim. It directs their actions, but it is entirely subjective. It is a principle they have chosen for their own pathological state.
I should pause there, actually, just to clarify a term for you. When the text uses the word pathological, it does not mean a disease or a psychological compulsion the way we use it today.
Good catch, yes.
In this philosophical context, pathological simply means being affected by emotions, senses, or physical desires. So, a maxim based on revenge is a pathological maxim. It's driven by an emotional response to being wronged.
That is a crucial distinction. And the text contrasts these subjective, emotionally driven maxims with practical laws. If a condition is recognized as objective, meaning it is logically valid for the will of every single rational being, then it elevates from a mere maxim to a practical law.
So it has to apply to everyone.
Everyone. You might hold your maxim of revenge very dearly, but if you look at it through the lens of pure reason, you quickly see it cannot be a practical law. If it were a rule for everyone to constantly seek revenge, it would inherently contradict itself and lead to the destruction of the very society that allows the individual to exist.
The argument further refines this by discussing imperatives. For beings like us, where reason does not automatically and flawlessly dictate our will because we are constantly influenced by our sensory desires, rules take the form of imperatives.
Commands characterized by the word ought or shall.
Right. But not all imperatives are equal. There are hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives.
Let's quietly walk through the hypothetical ones first. These are described as mere precepts of skill. They are conditional. They tell you, if you want a specific effect, here is the means to attain it.
So, means to an end.
Exactly. A common example is telling someone they must be industrious and thrifty in their youth, so they do not suffer poverty in their old age.
Which is a perfectly valid, practically useful precept. But notice its structure. The will is directed towards something else that it desires. In this case, financial security in old age.
Right, the outcome.
Yes, the necessity of the action is entirely dependent on whether the person actually desires that outcome. Perhaps they plan to rely on other resources, or they simply don't care about the future.
Yeah.
Because the necessity of the rule depends on a subjective, contingent desire, it can never be a universal law.
Which leads directly to the alternative, the categorical imperative. A categorical imperative determines the will simply as a will, regardless of the desired effect or whether you even have the power to achieve it.
It just stands on its own.
Completely. It is entirely independent of those pathological conditions we defined earlier. Consider the rule. You should never make a deceitful promise.
Even if lying saves you money or embarrassment.
Exactly. This rule concerns the volition itself, completely independent of whatever physical or social goals you might achieve by lying. Because it determines the will a priori, without reliance on external conditions or desires, it alone qualifies as a true practical law.
This distinction reveals a much broader realization about how we make decisions. The text argues in its first theorem that all practical principles that presuppose an object, or what it calls the matter of the faculty of desire, as the determining ground of the will, are entirely empirical.
And because they are empirical, they can furnish no practical laws.
Right. To put that in practical terms for you, the matter of desire is just whatever specific object or outcome you are chasing. If your desire for that object is the condition for making your rule, then your choice is determined by the expected pleasure of achieving that object.
But here is the fatal logical flaw for any universal law. Susceptibility to pleasure or pain can only be known empirically.
You cannot know entirely a priori prior to experience whether an object will bring you pleasure, pain, or indifference. You have to experience it. Furthermore, what brings you pleasure might bring someone else pain.
Because this principle is based on a totally subjective condition that varies from person to person, it lacks objective necessity. It changes. Therefore, it can never serve as the foundation for a universal law.
This realization about objective necessity naturally unfolds into the second theorem. The text suggests that all material practical principles, anything based on the pleasure or pain received from an object, are ultimately of one and the same kind. They all fall under the general umbrella of self-love or private happiness.
The logic here is beautifully uncompromising. It states that pleasure is founded on the susceptibility of the subject. It belongs to feeling, to the senses, not to the pure understanding. So if your will is determined by the sensation of agreeableness you expect from an object, you are operating on the principle of self-love.
The book provides a rich tapestry of examples to illustrate just how universal this principle of self-love is when we rely on material desires. It asks us to consider a person who loves literature. They might have in their hands a highly instructive, rare book that they cannot easily obtain again.
But they return it unread, simply so they won't miss a hunting trip.
Yes, or consider someone who deeply values fine intellectual conversation. They are in the midst of a wonderful discussion, but they depart early so they won't be late for a meal, or they leave that intellectual environment to take their place at the gaming table.
There is even the example of a person who generally takes pleasure in benefiting the poor, but actively repulses a beggar because they only have just enough money in their pocket to pay for their admission to the theater.
These scenarios are quietly powerful. They demonstrate that if the determination of a person's will rests on the feeling of agreeableness they expect, it does not matter to them at all what sort of ideas are affecting them.
They do not distinguish between high art and base entertainment.
Not at all. They only care about the intensity, the duration, and the ease of obtaining that pleasure.
To cement this, we are given a striking analogy about gold. To a person who simply wants money to spend, it is completely irrelevant whether the gold was dug out of a mountain or washed out of the sand, provided it is accepted everywhere at the same value.
Right, the source of the gold doesn't matter.
Exactly. In the exact same way, a person driven by the enjoyment of life does not ask whether the ideas giving them pleasure originate in the higher understanding or the physical senses. They only ask how much pleasure they will receive and for how long.
This brings us to a critique leveled against a common philosophical compromise, what the text calls a syncretistic age. There is this illusion, a sort of shallow attempt at harmony, where thinkers try to divide desires into higher intellectual desires and lower sensory ones, while still claiming both are based on the feeling of pleasure.
The argument rejects this compromise entirely. It maintains that if a desire determines your choice by presupposing a feeling of pleasure, its capability to move you depends entirely on the inner sense being agreeably affected.
It's the same fuel.
It is the exact same vital force manifesting itself, whether you are reading poetry or eating a meal. You cannot claim an intellectual pursuit is a different kind of moral determination if it still relies entirely on the anticipation of personal pleasure.
If we accept that premise, then true, pure reason must operate entirely differently. It must determine the will immediately, without any intervening feeling of pleasure or pain. Not even pleasure in the law itself. It must be a purely formal determination.
And this brings us to a concept we all hold dear, but which is carefully dismantled here as a foundation for moral law, the concept of happiness.
Oh, this is a big one.
It really is. The text acknowledges that to be happy is necessarily the wish of every finite, rational being. We are not self-sufficient. We have physical and emotional needs. Therefore, happiness is inevitably a determining principle of our faculty of desire.
But a profound warning follows that. Just because everyone desires happiness does not mean happiness can be a universal practical law. Happiness is merely a general name for subjective determining principles. It defines nothing specifically.
Right, because what brings you happiness changes constantly as your feelings, your environment, and your wants fluctuate.
To illustrate why private welfare cannot be a universal law, the text points out that if everyone is pursuing their own private welfare, the result is not harmony, but extreme opposition. It quotes a satirical poem depicting a married couple bent on mutual ruin through their selfish desires, saying, "Oh, marvelous harmony, what he wishes, she wishes also."
Both wishing for ruin. It also references the historical pledge between King Francis I and the Emperor Charles V. Francis stated, "What my brother Charles wishes, that I wish also."
Which sounds incredibly harmonious on the surface.
It does, until you realize what they both wished for was the exclusive control of Milan. They were in perfect agreement on the object of their desire, which resulted in devastating, bloody conflict.
So if a law is based on everyone pursuing their own material happiness, the occasional exceptions and conflicts are endless.
Endless. It is completely unfit for universal legislation because desiring the same object often destroys harmony.
Which leads to the third theorem, the ultimate requirement for a universal law. Since empirical matter, the object of desire, cannot serve as a law, a rational being must conceive their maxims as determining the will by their form alone.
By their form alone, we must completely strip away the matter. If we abstract from a law every single object of the will, nothing remains but the mere form of universal legislation.
I struggle to see how that works in practice sometimes. Determining a will by pure form sounds incredibly abstract. How do we test if a maxim operates by form alone?
It is abstract, but to truly understand what it means to determine the will by form alone, the text presents a vital thought experiment concerning an unrecorded deposit. I want you to walk through this scenario carefully with us. Suppose you have made it your personal maxim to increase your wealth by every safe means.
A very common, very pragmatic maxim.
Indeed. Now, imagine you have a significant financial deposit in your hands. The owner of this deposit suddenly dies, and crucially, he has left absolutely no written record of it.
None at all.
No one else knows you have this wealth. This is the perfectly safe opportunity to apply your subjective maxim and increase your fortune by simply keeping the money.
But the test of practical reason is to ask, can this subjective maxim become a universal practical law? So you attempt to universalize it. You propose the law. Everyone may deny holding a deposit which no one can prove was made.
And the moment you attempt to make that a universal law, you see the logic unfold. If that were a universal law, the very concept of a deposit would cease to exist.
Think about it. No one would ever entrust their property to another without a record, because the universal law dictates it would simply be kept.
The law, if universalized, immediately destroys itself.
It is a self-evident contradiction. If you use your inclination, in this case avarice, as a principle of determination fitted to be a universal practical law, it annihilates its own premise. Therefore, the will cannot be determined by the desire for the wealth. If it is to act morally, it must be determined purely by the legislative form of the rule itself. It must avoid internal contradiction.
This rigorous stripping away of all desires, all empirical conditions, all pathological influences leads us to the ultimate conclusion of this section regarding the nature of the will itself. We are faced with two interconnected logical problems.
The first problem being, supposing the mere legislative form of maxims is the only sufficient determining principle of a will. What exactly is the nature of that will?
The reasoning here is incredibly precise. The bare form of the law is not an object of the senses. You cannot touch or see a universal form. Therefore, it does not belong to the physical world of phenomena.
Right, the natural world.
Exactly. In nature, everything operates according to the strict law of physical causality. Every single event is determined by a preceding physical phenomenon. But if a will is determined solely by this pure legislative form, it must be conceived as completely independent of the natural law of phenomena.
It operates entirely outside the chain of physical cause and effect. And this brings us to a quiet, truly monumental realization. This independence from empirical conditions, this ability to be determined by nothing but the mere legislative form of the maxim, is the strictest, most transcendental definition of a free will.
And when we say transcendental here, we mean operating completely beyond the sensory bounds of natural cause and effect.
Right. And conversely, which brings us to the second problem, if we suppose a will is free, what law alone is competent to determine it?
Well, since a free will is independent of empirical conditions, the world of sense, it cannot find its principle of determination in the material objects of desire. It must find it entirely in the formal, universal legislation of pure reason. Form and freedom are inextricably linked. You cannot have one without the other.
It is a profound shift in how we view our own agency. We are moving from a world where we are merely reacting to sensory inputs, governed by subjective self-love, physical causes, and the endless, chaotic pursuit of pleasure. We are shifting toward the pure, almost mathematical elegance of a will, determined only by the form of a universal law.
It asks us to view our own autonomy through a lens of absolute purity, demanding that we step outside of our immediate physical wants. But it also leaves us with a deeply provocative thought to consider as we move forward.
If you reflect on everything we have just unraveled here, if true freedom of the will only exists when we completely strip away our personal desires, our pursuit of private happiness, and all our emotional reactions to the world, does being completely free mean becoming completely detached from what makes us human? Hold on to that tension as we turn the page to see how this incredibly strict free will actually operates in the real world.
You are walking through the architecture of your own mind. We are stepping directly back into the quiet, monumental corridors of Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason.
Exactly. We're picking right up where we left off.
Yeah, this book is, it's a meticulously drawn map, one that charts the very landscape of human morality, reason, and duty.
And our mission right now, together, is to understand a very precise, very profound realization.
The exact moment a human being discovers they are truly undeniably free. So settle in. We are looking at the deepest layers of what it means to choose.
It requires a quiet sort of focus.
It does. Okay, let's unpack this. We are presented with a fascinating chicken or the egg scenario regarding the very foundation of our morality. What comes first in our conscious mind?
Right, the origin point.
Is it our knowledge of our own freedom, or is it our knowledge of the moral law?
It is a profound starting point. Because if you think about the natural world you observe around you every day, you realize we absolutely cannot know freedom directly from our physical experience.
Right, because the physical world is
Governed by strict, unbreakable mechanism. It is pure cause and effect. A rock falls because of gravity. A plant grows towards the light.
it's just physics.
Exactly. That physical mechanism is the exact direct opposite of freedom. You cannot extract the concept of a free will from a universe of falling locks and predictable biology.
So freedom can't be the thing we notice first.
No, the realization of freedom cannot come first. Instead, it is the moral law that hits us first. It forces itself upon our consciousness the exact moment we begin to formulate rules for our own will.
Kant uses a remarkably vivid thought experiment here to prove this, and it really highlights how predictable our biological urges actually are.
The gallows example.
Yeah, the gallows. Imagine a man who claims that his lustful appetites are completely irresistible. He says that when the object of his desire and the opportunity are right in front of him, he is simply a slave to his passions.
He says he literally cannot help himself.
Right, but then we are asked to change the environment. Suppose a gallows were erected right outside the house where he finds this opportunity. And suppose he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would be hanged on those gallows immediately after gratifying his lust.
The ultimate consequence.
Could he control his passion then? We don't really need to wait long for his answer. He absolutely would resist.
Without a second thought.
His physical fear of death easily overpowers his physical lust.
Precisely. The urge he claimed was irresistible evaporates the second his survival is threatened.
Which proves
It proves his urges are completely dictated by his environment. Both the lust and the fear are just mechanical, empirical impulses. It's cause and effect.
biology overguiding biology.
Yes. But then we are asked to imagine a second scenario. And this is where the true nature of the human mind is revealed. Suppose this same man is ordered by a tyrannical prince to bear false witness against an honorable, innocent man.
A completely different type of pressure.
The prince wants to destroy this innocent person under a plausible pretext, and he threatens our man with the exact same immediate execution on the gallows if he refuses to lie.
Wait, so the physical stakes are exactly the same? Death.
Death.
But the moral stakes are entirely different?
Exactly. Now, the man might not be able to guarantee what he would do in that terrifying moment. He might admit that his love of life is incredibly strong and, well, he might end up caving to the tyrant.
Sure, humans are frail.
But he must unhesitatingly admit that it is possible for him to overcome his love of life and choose death over lying.
Because he knows it's wrong.
What's fascinating here is the precise mechanics of his realization. He judges that he can do a certain thing simply because he is conscious that he ought to do it.
The ought reveals the can.
Yes, the moral duty to not bear false witness against an innocent man reveals his own freedom. It's a fact which, but for the moral law, he would never have known.
That is incredible.
The moral law is the lens through which his freedom becomes visible to him.
Think about how wild that is for your own life. You only know you are free because you feel the weight of responsibility.
It's a heavy realization.
It is. And now that we see the moral law reveals our freedom, we are introduced to the fundamental law of pure practical reason in the text. It is stated with almost mathematical precision.
The categorical imperative.
Yes, it reads, act so that the maxim of thy will can always at the same time hold good as a principle of universal legislation.
That is a staggering sentence when you truly break it down. Kant uses the term a priori to describe this.
Meaning prior to experience.
Basically, yes. It just means it is an unconditional command that exists prior to and independent of any of our empirical experiences. It does not say, act this way if you want to be happy.
Or act this way to avoid punishment.
Right. Those would be conditional, based on physical desires or fears. This rule says we absolutely must proceed in a certain manner, regardless of the consequences.
So it's objective.
It is a direct, objective determination of the will by the practical rule itself. It is a fact of reason. It is not a fact we reason out from prior data. It forces itself upon us.
It doesn't borrow anything from our personal experiences.
Or our upbringing, or any external authority. It originates from pure reason itself.
And there is a beautiful, quiet distinction drawn here between different types of beings. This moral law applies to all rational beings, even an infinite being, like God.
Yes, the concept of a holy will.
But for an infinite being, this law doesn't feel restrictive or demanding. Their pure will is naturally, perfectly aligned with it. This state is defined as holiness.
For us.
Right, for us. For finite human beings who are constantly affected by physical wants, needs, and biological motives, we don't have holy wills. For us, the law takes the form of an imperative.
It feels like an external weight.
It feels like a duty, an intellectual compulsion that constantly resists our physical desires.
Because we are human, we are subject to those physical affections. Even though we are not wholly determined by them, our subjective wishes often oppose the pure objective principle.
We have temptations.
Always. Therefore, we cannot achieve what the book calls apodeictic certainty.
Which means?
An absolute flawless mathematical guarantee that our intentions are completely pure. Human virtue is the endless, indefinite progress of our maxims toward that holiness.
Like a pursuit.
Virtue is our constant, steady disposition to advance. It is a direction, an ongoing effort to approximate a holy will on a treadmill we can never actually step off.
So if human virtue is just an endless struggle toward a standard we can never perfectly reach, what actually grounds our morality? How do we know what the standard even is?
That is the core question.
That leads to a massive line in the sand regarding the autonomy of our will. Theorem the fourth in the book. Autonomy literally means the mind giving the law to itself, independent of any material desire.
Self-legislation.
Exactly. The moment your will depends on an external desire, an object, or a physical impulse, it falls into heteronomy. And heteronomy destroys the very foundation of morality.
It does, because heteronomy means you're relying on the physical laws of nature, following an impulse or an inclination.
Rather than pure reason.
Kant occasionally uses the word pathological here, which to a modern ear sounds like he's diagnosing a disease or calling someone a psychopath.
Yeah, it sounds intense.
But in his vocabulary, pathological just means anything driven by pathos, by emotion, biological instinct, or physical feeling. When you just seek advice on how to rationally fulfill a biological or emotional drive, your mind is no longer legislating universally.
You're just managing your appetites.
Exactly. Private happiness is the ultimate trap here. The principle of private happiness can never ever be the foundation of a universal moral law.
Because it changes from person to person.
Happiness rests entirely on empirical data. It's highly subjective. What makes you happy today might not make you happy tomorrow, and it certainly won't make the person sitting next to you happy.
It's too unstable.
It can supply general rules of thumb, but never a strict universal command that holds good always and necessarily.
The analogies used in the text to illustrate this are incredibly striking and frankly pretty funny if you think about them in a modern context.
They really are.
Imagine a guy sitting across from you trying to justify why he lied under oath. First, he claims it was his sacred duty to consult his own happiness.
A sacred duty to himself.
Right. Then he lists all the financial advantages he gained and points out how clever he was to avoid detection. Finally, he looks you in the eye and seriously affirms he has fulfilled a true human duty.
You wouldn't applaud his logic.
You'd probably laugh in his face or check to make sure your wallet was still on the table.
And yet, if a man is merely regulating his actions for his own advantage in a standard business deal, you wouldn't object. The boundary between true morality and basic self-love is so sharply marked that the commonest eye can distinguish them.
Anyone can see the difference.
There is another brilliant example. A steward. Imagine someone recommends a steward or a financial advisor to manage all your affairs.
Okay.
They praise this man as incredibly prudent, tirelessly active in advancing his own interests. And to assure you he isn't vulgar, they say he doesn't seek pleasure in money or coarse wantonness, but in refined knowledge and philosophical conversation.
Sounds like a cultured guy.
But his ultimate driving force is purely his own self-interest. You would never blindly trust such a man with your life's affairs, because the moment his refined interest conflicted with yours, he would betray you.
Right, because his foundation is still just his own happiness. There is also the example of the cheating gambler, which perfectly captures that unavoidable internal voice.
That's a powerful one.
A man cheats at cards and wins a fortune. From the perspective of happiness and self-love, he can say to himself, I'm a prudent man, for I've enriched my treasure.
He succeeded at his goal.
But the moment he compares himself with the moral law, he is forced to use an entirely different criterion. He must say to himself, I am a worthless fellow.
Think about the last time you took a shortcut at work. Maybe you got the raise, maybe you got the praise. You feel like a prudent winner.
Outwardly successful.
But when you lay your head on the pillow, there's that quiet, unavoidable voice calling you a fraud. That split right there. The profound difference between feeling financially enriched and feeling morally bankrupt proves that the principle of morality is entirely distinct from the principle of private happiness.
So if morality has absolutely nothing to do with securing our own happiness, what does this all mean for our concepts of justice and punishment?
It shifts the entire paradigm.
Because we usually think of punishment as a tool to deter bad behavior, essentially making bad behavior unhappy so people won't do it.
This is a crucial pivot in the book. If morality were just about pursuing happiness, then punishment would simply be a physical evil meant to deter you from making choices that ultimately hurt your happiness.
Like training an animal.
Exactly. It would be a training mechanism, like shocking a rat in a maze. But the argument here is that punishment must inherently be about justice. Justice constitutes the essence of the notion of punishment.
It has to have intrinsic moral weight.
If a crime is only considered evil because it brings about a punishment that damages your personal happiness, then escaping the punishment would mean there was no longer any evil in the action.
Wow, so if you don't get caught, it wasn't wrong.
Under that flawed logic, yes. To view rewards and punishments merely as machinery to push rational creatures toward happiness is to reduce the human will to a pure mechanism.
It completely destroys true freedom.
You are treating human beings like programmable machines, not autonomous agents.
This dismantling of false foundations goes even further, right into the psychology of how we feel about doing good. There was a popular theory at the time called the moral sense.
Right, the idea of an innate feeling.
Some philosophers argued that we have a special instinct, a moral feeling, where being virtuous naturally gives us pleasure and being vicious gives us pain.
That sounds nice on paper.
It does, but the text points out that it secretly reduces morality back to a desire for private happiness. You're just doing the right thing to get that warm, fuzzy feeling.
It's just a refined addiction to a good emotion.
And there's a massive logical fallacy here. You cannot feel the pleasure of virtue or the bitter remorse of vice unless you already understand what duty is.
That is a vital sequence of events. You must first appreciate the authority of the moral law. You must recognize the immediate dignity that following the law gives you in your own eyes before you can feel that satisfaction.
The duty comes first.
Always. You cannot feel this specific type of satisfaction prior to the knowledge of obligation. Making the feeling the basis of the duty is putting the cart before the horse.
Right.
If we just relied on a feeling for the law, it would destroy the notion of duty entirely and replace it with a mere mechanical play of refined inclinations. We would just be chasing an emotional high.
To make this absolute airtight, the book provides an exhaustive table of all material principles of morality to show why every single one of them fails.
It systematically dismantles them.
It breaks them down into subjective and objective, and then internal and external. Under subjective external, you have education, championed by thinkers like Montaigne, and the civil constitution, championed by Mandeville.
And under subjective internal.
You have physical feeling, like Epicurus, and moral feeling, like Hutcheson. Let's look at why those fail.
Take education. Education is just learning what your specific society rewards. It's totally relative.
And the civil constitution.
That's just avoiding jail.
Yeah.
Both are empirical and conditional. And even on the objective side, they fail if they are material.
Like internal objective perfection. the theories of the Stoics.
which ultimately just means improving our talents and skills for the advantages of life. It's self-improvement for personal gain.
An external objective perfection, like obeying the will of God.
Yes, as proposed by Crucius. This fails entirely if we only obey God to gain a reward in heaven or avoid a punishment in hell.
Because then it's transactional.
That is still just self-preservation. It is still just the pursuit of happiness, just projected into the afterlife.
So none of them work.
None of them. All of these principles, whether based on education, society, feelings, self-improvement, or even theology, are empirical. They all secretly rely on the expectation of happiness.
They all fall into heteronomy.
Exactly. Therefore, they are all completely incapable of furnishing the supreme, universal moral law. The pure, formal, practical principle is the only one left standing.
If we pull back and look at the larger architecture of this philosophy, there is a remarkable contrast with Kant's earlier work, the Critique of Pure Speculative Reason.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the contrast is stunning.
In the theoretical realm, to know anything scientifically, we needed physical space and time. We could only know objects of possible experience.
The world of phenomena.
Theoretical reason went as far as proving that a world beyond our senses, a world of what Kant calls noumena, the invisible reality of things as they are in themselves, was conceptually possible.
But it hit a brick wall.
Right, it could not give us any positive knowledge of that unconditioned world. It completely cut off all view of it. We could guess it was there, but we couldn't access it.
But practical reason achieves the impossible.
Mm-hmm.
The moral law gives us a fact that is absolutely inexplicable from any data of the sensible physical world.
It breaches the wall.
It points directly to a pure world of the understanding. It proves that a supersensible system of nature, an intelligible order of things, actually exists, and that we are part of it.
Not just observers.
No, we don't just think about this higher invisible world, we act within it. And we are given practical, everyday tests for our maxims to prove this.
Yes, the test of the universal law of nature. Imagine you are disposed to give false testimony to get out of a tight spot. You must ask, what if my maxim were to hold as a universal law of nature?
What if lying was like gravity?
It is instantly obvious that a world where untruthful statements have the force of physical law destroys the very concept of a promise or a truth. It cannot maintain itself. The logic collapses.
Or consider the maxim of arbitrarily taking one's own life to escape a painful existence. If that became a permanent biological law of nature, that life destroys itself the moment it feels pain, it would destroy the system of nature entirely.
Life would cease to exist.
Our private inclinations, driven by biological and physical laws, simply cannot form the basis of a natural whole.
Therefore, we belong to two worlds. Through our physical desires, we are subject to the empirical laws of the sensible world. We get hungry, we get tired, we want comfort.
The physical reality.
But through our reason, we are conscious of a law that originates from an entirely different natural order. We look upon this supersensible system as an object of our will. We are, quite literally, giving objective reality to the invisible world through our moral choices.
And this leads to the ultimate deduction of the principles of pure practical reason. In theoretical science, if you want to prove a fundamental faculty exists, you need empirical evidence. You need an experiment. You need experience.
You need to observe it.
But the moral law cannot be proved by any empirical deduction. Even if you gathered all this speculative and empirical data in the universe, you couldn't prove the objective reality of the moral law by looking backward at human behavior.
Because history is full of people making terrible, selfish choices.
Constantly. And yet the moral law stands firmly established of itself. In a breathtaking philosophical reversal, we realize we don't need a scientific deduction to prove the moral law.
The moral law itself is the proof.
The moral law is the deduction. It is the undeniable fact that proves the reality of our freedom. We know we are free not because we can isolate a freedom gene in a microscope, but because the undeniable weight of moral duty proves that our will is the cause of objects, rather than physical objects being the ultimate cause of our will.
Every single time you pause, wrestling with a difficult moral choice, feeling that intense internal friction between what you want to do and what you know you ought to do, you are standing on the bridge between two universes.
Two entirely different orders of existence.
You are physically standing in the world of cause and effect, a world of falling rocks and biological instincts. But your mind is reaching into the archetypal world, operating under the autonomy of pure reason. You are realizing your own absolute, unprogrammable freedom in real time.
This raises an important question as we continue mapping this out. If our moral duty is the ultimate proof of our absolute unprogrammable freedom, what happens when we start building artificial intelligences or neurological frameworks that attempt to perfectly mimic or map moral choices?
That complicates things immensely.
If a machine acts universally, does it have a will? Or is it just the ultimate biological clockwork? If our brains are purely deterministic, where does the ought actually reside? It's something to think about the next time you ask an algorithm to make a decision for you, or the next time you wonder if your choices are truly your own. Because as we push deeper into the next section of the text, we have to ask how this unseen world actually interfaces with the law.
And as we move right into this next profound exploration within Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason, we find ourselves immediately immersed in a concept that just completely redefines the architecture of human agency.
It really does. It's staggering.
It is. It's this quiet, almost awestruck realization for the reader. We're looking at a deeply contemplative framing of how human written dictates moral action, and doing so entirely independently of our physical desires. The book forces you to confront this central, inescapable tension. How do we actually prove that humans have free will?
Right.
Because you feel it, certainly, I feel it, but proving it logically, fundamentally, that is an entirely different endeavor.
What's fascinating here is how the text addresses the absolute limits of speculative theoretical philosophy. Theoretical reason, when it looks out at the physical universe, could never actually prove the existence of free will. The best it could possibly do was carve out a negative space. The author describes it as a vacant place.
A vacant place, like an empty placeholder.
Exactly. It left room where freedom might theoretically exist without breaking the fundamental laws of logic. But it couldn't fill that space. It's the moral law, that undeniable internal sense of duty that you experience daily, that finally steps in to fill that vacant place. It proves our freedom by giving it a positive definition. It shows us reason directly determining the will without any physical intermediary at all.
Let me see if I have this right, because visualizing that divide between the sensory world, which the book calls phenomena, and the supersensible world, the noumena, it's tricky.
It's very tricky.
Is the sensory world kind of like an infinite line of falling dominoes?
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it, yes.
So in this physical sensory realm, every single falling domino, every event, every physical action you take is entirely caused with a domino that fell right behind it.
Right, the chain of causality is infinite.
And it's entirely conditioned. Nothing happens without a prior physical cause. But freedom, would freedom be the hand that reaches down from outside that line and pushes the very first domino?
Precisely. It is an unconditioned causality. It's an action determined wholly and absolutely by itself. And the terrifying thing is that unconditioned causality cannot be found anywhere in the observable universe.
Nowhere.
Nowhere. If you look for it in the realm of phenomena, you're only ever going to find more falling dominoes. You'll find mechanism and physical necessity stretching backward ad infinitum. But, and this is the key, because you belong not just to the world of sense, but also to the world of understanding, the intelligible world, your causality can be physically unconditioned.
It changes everything about how you view your own life. Just when you pause and reflect on your own choices, the magnitude of this really hits you.
It's a heavy realization.
When you make a truly moral decision, one based on pure duty rather than just chasing a physical reward or trying to avoid pain, you aren't just reacting to a previous domino. You are stepping outside of that physical mechanism entirely.
You're acting as a first cause.
You are. But wait, to truly appreciate this rescue mission Kant is pulling off here, we really have to look at the threat that nearly destroyed this entire framework. Okay, let's unpack this, because the book introduces a massive philosophical antagonist here, the Scottish philosopher David Hume.
Yes.
His argument was essentially a devastating assault on the very concept of cause and effect.
It was a brilliant and deeply unsettling assault. Hume looked at causality and realized a terrifying vulnerability in how we perceive the world. He argued that just because we see event A followed by event B, we have absolutely no way of proving that they are necessarily connected.
Right.
We see a lightning flash and then we hear thunder. Hume pointed out that we cannot know independent of experience, what philosophers call a priori, that the lightning must cause the thunder. We've simply gotten used to seeing them together.
We've just developed a habit.
Exactly, a habit.
Yeah.
Therefore, Hume argued, the entire notion of causality is fictitious. It's a subjective custom. It's a psychological expectation rather than an objective reality out there in the universe.
But wait, isn't Hume kind of right? I mean, from a purely empirical standpoint, we do just see the lightning and then hear the thunder. We don't actually see the invisible tether connecting them.
Empirically, yes, he's observing the limits of the senses correctly.
But the consequence of taking that logic to its extreme is just absolute chilling universal skepticism. If causality is nothing more than a human habit, just a trick of the imagination, then we can never actually say that anything must happen. We'd have to surrender the entire universe to blind chance.
It's the collapse of all rational inquiry. And it didn't just threaten physical science, it threatened mathematics as well. Hume incorrectly believed that mathematics was analytical.
Let's break that down for a second. Analytical meaning the definition is already contained in the concept, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man.
Right.
You don't need to do a chemistry experiment to prove that the definition is right there in the word itself.
Exactly. Hume thought math was just stating identical properties, proceeding merely by the principle of contradiction. But Kant demonstrates that geometry, for example, is actually synthetical.
Synthetical meaning it builds new knowledge. It connects two different things together.
Right. It proceeds from one property to another entirely distinct property, connecting them necessarily. If Hume's skepticism held true, even the absolute undeniable proof of geometry would completely collapse. It would become nothing more than an empirical habit.
Wow.
Mathematics would have to lower its pride and rely on the kindness of observers' witnesses who agree that, yes, these geometrical theorems have usually been true in the past, so we can probably expect them to be true in the future. It's a terrible overthrow of the chief branches of human knowledge.
Which makes Kant's solution feel so triumphant, yet so quietly profound. Kant realized that the fatal flaw in Hume's thinking was treating the objects of our experience as things in themselves.
Yes, the ding and sitch.
Right. If objects are things in themselves, Hume is right. We can never see that hidden tether connecting A to B. But Kant says the objects we interact with are merely phenomena. They're representations filtered through the architecture of our own minds.
And this is the turning point. The mind is not a passive mirror just reflecting a chaotic universe. The mind actively structures experience. Kant deduced that causality is an a priori concept. It's a necessary category of the pure understanding.
So, to use a modern analogy, it's essentially the built-in operating system of the human mind that makes any experience of the world possible in the first place.
That's a great way to frame it. Without the category of causality pre-installed, so to speak, we couldn't process existence at all. It would just be noise. By proving that causality originates in the pure understanding, completely independent of sensory input, he completely overthrew Hume's empiricism. He saved physical science and he saved mathematics, anchoring them both in objective necessity.
So he saves science. But hold on, that brilliant victory immediately creates a massive dilemma for the rest of the book.
It does.
If causality is a concept meant specifically to organize the things we can see and touch, the phenomena, how in the world can we apply it to things that lie entirely beyond our experience?
The noumena.
Exactly. How do we apply cause and effect to noumena? To free will? Or to God? We don't have sensory intuition for these things. We can't put them in a laboratory.
It's a critical boundary line, and Kant is very strict about this constraint. We absolutely cannot use causality to gain theoretical knowledge of the supersensible. You cannot define these concepts to produce scientific knowledge of them.
Because you need the sensory data.
Because, as you rightly pointed out, theoretical knowledge requires sensible intuition. You cannot put free will in a test tube. If you try to use causality for that kind of theoretical speculation, you are stepping into a void. You're indulging in vain curiosity rather than building solid knowledge.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because while we can't use causality for a theoretical scientific purpose regarding the unseen, the book reveals we can use it for a practical purpose.
Yes, the pure concept of causality resides in the understanding, independent of sensory conditions. So it is theoretically possible to apply it to the supersensible, even if that application remains an empty notion from a strictly scientific standpoint. But reason has another relationship, not just to objects of knowledge, but to the faculty of desire, to the will. The pure will has its own causality, and it is determined directly by the moral law.
But if we can't observe it in a test tube, isn't it just a fantasy? How do we actually know it's real?
Because we don't need a sensory intuition to prove this causality. The undeniable fact that we experience the moral law, that we feel its binding authority upon us, is entirely sufficient. The moral law gives this empty, abstract concept of unconditioned causality practical reality.
It takes this purely formal concept and exhibits it in reality right there in our daily lives through our moral intentions.
Exactly.
It's a breathtaking synthesis, and that leads us directly into how this practical reason actually operates, which requires us to shift our focus to the true objects of practical reason, the concepts of good and evil.
The author is incredibly meticulous in redefining these terms. It's insisted that to determine whether something is an object of pure practical reason, we don't look at our physical ability to achieve it.
Right. The physical outcome doesn't matter yet.
We look only at the moral possibility of the action. Therefore, the only true objects of practical reason are the good meaning an object necessarily desired according to a principle of reason, and the evil an object necessarily shunned according to a principle of reason.
Wait, so if I do something good just because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside, is Kant saying that's not actually a moral act?
That is exactly what is being argued, and it highlights a very dangerous trap that is so easy to fall into. It's the trap of confusing the good with the pleasant.
Ah.
If we base our definition of good merely on what promises pleasure and evil on what threatens pain, we're surrendering entirely to empirical experience. We can't know beforehand what will cause pleasure or pain. We just have to constantly test things in the physical world. If we do that, the good stops being good in itself. It just becomes a tool, a means to the end of feeling pleasant.
Which strips it of any universal moral weight?
Precisely. This is where a deeply nuanced distinction within the German language is brought up, which allows us to avoid the ambiguity that plagued the older Latin terminology.
The linguistics here are fascinating.
They are. The Latin phrase, nihil appetimus nisi subratione boni, we desire nothing except under the idea of the good, is dangerously ambiguous. It could mean we desire something because we recognize it as morally good, or it could mean we just call something good simply because we desire it physically.
But it blends the two.
But the German language separates these concepts cleanly. It has das Gut for the moral good, and an entirely different word, das Wohl, for physical well-being. Similarly, it uses das Böse for moral evil, and das Übel or das Weh for physical ill or woe.
That linguistic separation is so illuminating. It's like the difference in English between saying he is a good man versus this is a good pizza. One speaks to a profound moral character and the other just means it's pleasant to the senses. You wouldn't judge a pizza's moral standing and you shouldn't judge a human being's worth based purely on whether they make you feel pleasant.
That's a perfect grounding of the concept.
Yeah.
The book gives incredibly vivid real-world examples to drive this home. Think of the story of the Stoic philosopher, writhing in the most severe, agonizing paroxysms of gout. He's in absolute physical misery, and yet he cries out, "Pain, however thou tormentest me, I will never admit that thou art an evil." People might laugh at him, but he was entirely right.
I mean, it's easy to say pain isn't an evil when you're writing a heavy philosophical treatise, but try telling that to someone who just stubbed their toe in the dark at 2 a.m.
It's true. It sounds almost absurd in the moment of suffering. But structurally, the Stoic was right, because he recognized the boundary between the physical and the moral. The pain he was experiencing was a bad thing. It was an ill, an übel. It was actively harming his physical condition. But it was not an evil, a booze.
It didn't touch his soul.
It didn't diminish his internal worth as a human being. It didn't reflect a failure of his pure will. If he had been conscious of having told a single cowardly lie, that would have been an evil that lowered his pride. But mere physical pain, that cannot touch the moral worth of the person.
It's such a powerful lens to view the world through. Take the example of a surgical operation. If you undergo surgery, the slicing of the scalpel is an ill. It causes profound physical pain and distress. But your reason, and the reason of everyone around you, acknowledges that the surgery is good.
Yeah.
Or take the example of a bully, someone who just delights in annoying and tormenting peaceful people. If that bully finally receives a right good beating, the beating itself is a physical ill. It's painful. But everyone's reason, even the reason of the bully himself, if he's being honest, recognizes that the beating is good. Justice has been served. The physical pain is entirely subordinate to the moral judgment.
Which brings us to the very foundation of how we make those judgments.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps the most revolutionary concept in this section, the paradox of method.
So what does this all mean? Because this paradox of method feels like it takes the entire history of human philosophy and just turns it completely upside down.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that for centuries, philosophers operated under a fundamental assumption about how to build an ethical system. But the paradox of method states that we cannot determine the concept of good and evil first, and then try to build a moral law upon that foundation. It must be the exact reverse.
The complete reverse.
We must establish the moral law first, and only then does that pure, a priori law determine what is truly good or evil.
So, you cannot let your desired outcome dictate your morals. Your morals must dictate your desired outcome. It's like trying to build a house starting from the roof down if you do it the ancient way.
A house from the roof down, yes.
The ancients were constantly searching for the highest good, the summum bonum-like happiness or perfection, whatever it was. They thought, if we can just figure out what the ultimate object of desire is, we can say whatever leads to this object is the law.
And that ancient method was doomed to fail. When you start with an object that you desire, your will is no longer determining itself. Your will is being dictated by external things, by empirical conditions, by how you feel about a specific outcome. This is defined as heteronomy being ruled by outside forces.
Heteronomy. Right.
If your morality is based on heteronomy, you can never arrive at a universal, absolute moral command because feelings and empirical conditions are always subjective and always changing.
To achieve true moral freedom, which is autonomy, the formal law of reason must come absolutely first. The moral law doesn't look at the sensory outcome. It doesn't care about the physical pleasure or the pain. It simply prescribes the universal legislative form of our actions. Only a will that conforms to this pure, unconditioned law is a truly good will.
And just as theoretical reason requires a structured system to understand the physical world, practical reason requires a system to understand this newly defined moral world. This is mapped out by detailing the categories of freedom.
Let's get into those.
In earlier philosophy, we saw the categories of physical nature forms of thought used to understand sensory objects. But these categories of freedom are meant purely for the determination of a free, elective will.
But wait, how do these actually differ from the categories of physical nature we talked about earlier, like causality and all that?
They possess a massive fundamental advantage. Theoretical categories are completely empty and meaningless unless they are fed sensory input from the physical world. They have to wait around for an intuition. But the categories of freedom don't have to wait for physical conditions at all.
Because they come from within.
Because they are based on a pure will, they literally produce the reality they refer to. When you form a moral intention based on these categories, that intention becomes a reality within the intelligible world in that very instant.
Okay, walk me through this table, because it sounds abstract, but I know it's incredibly structured in the text. Let's start with quantity. How does a free will measure the quantity of a moral rule?
It's an ascent from the individual to the universal. Under quantity, we begin with subjective maxims. These are the personal, practical opinions or rules an individual adopts for themselves.
Okay.
Then we move up a step to objective precepts, which are rules that hold a broader necessity but might still be tied to specific conditions. Finally, we ascend to a priori laws, objective and subjective principles of absolute freedom that apply universally to all rational beings.
So to put that in everyday terms, a subjective maxim is like my personal rule to say, skip the gym when I'm tired. It's my rule, but it's not a universal truth.
Right.
An objective precept might be a broader rule, like a doctor telling a patient they must exercise to heal a specific injury. It's necessary but conditional. But a universal law is something that applies universally, without exception, like the command to never treat another human being merely as a means to an end. It demands universal application.
Exactly. You move from the personal quirk to the universal duty. Next, the table looks at quality. It organizes the practical rules of how we engage with action itself. It breaks down into three types of rules: the perceptive, the prohibitive, and the acceptive. It charts the mechanics of how a free will chooses to move or stay still.
Okay, let's break those down. Perceptive sounds like prescribing action, like always tell the truth.
Correct. It's the rule of taking a positive moral action. Then you have the prohibitive, which are rules of omitting an action: never steal, never commit murder. They are negative boundaries drawn by the moral law.
And what about the acceptive? Because exceptions sounds like a dangerous concept when we're talking about absolute moral laws.
It is delicate, but it's the nuanced mechanics of when a general rule must bend to a higher universal moral law. It's not an exception based on physical desire or convenience, but an exception dictated by reason itself when duties conflict. It maps how a rigid moral compass navigates complex realities without losing its autonomy.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not a loophole for bad behavior. It's an emergency protocol for conflicting duties. So then we move to the final category, relation. How does this internal rulebook actually connect us to the rest of the world?
The category of relation maps how these rules apply to existence. It examines three distinct relationships. First, the relation to one's own personality, deeply assessing internal moral worth. Second, it looks at the relation to the condition of the person. This is where we differentiate, as we discussed earlier, between your physical state like having gout and your moral standing.
Assessing whether an action diminishes your physical well-being or your actual moral worth.
Precisely. And crucially, the third part outlines the reciprocal relationship. It examines how the free will of one person relates to the free will of others in a shared moral universe. It's the acknowledgement that my autonomy must coexist with your autonomy.
Observing these categories really forces you to examine your life through a completely different, almost uncomfortably clear lens. Every choice you make is suddenly subjected to this architecture. You have to ask yourself, in this moment, am I just acting out of habit? Am I just reacting to the domino behind me, chasing what is pleasant and running from what is painful? Or am I tapping into that unconditioned causality? Am I acting as a truly free agent, legislating a universal law in the intelligible world?
This raises an important question, though, regarding the lived experience of this philosophy. We've mapped out this pristine, pure, abstract moral law, residing entirely in the supersensible realm. But how does this purely rational, unconditioned law actually reach down and influence the messy physical reality of the human mind? How is it possible for an abstract concept of duty to generate a feeling, a drive within us that is powerful enough to overpower our deepest, most ingrained animal instincts and desires?
It's the ultimate bridge to cross. Because as we look deeper into the structural architecture of the will, we see that the very nature of human motivation doesn't just adapt, it begins to transform entirely right before our eyes, altering the fabric of how we experience duty, which leads us directly into how the subjective effect actually takes root.
And so we are continuing our journey straight into the architecture of human morality and practical reason right where we left off.
Exactly. We are still sitting quietly with this incredibly profound exploration of human freedom and moral duty that the book lays out.
Up until now, we've really just been dealing with pure, invisible moral principles, the kind of absolute theories that exist purely in the mind.
Right, the super sensible. But right now, we are crossing a vital threshold. We have to examine how those invisible laws actually apply to our messy, physical, everyday reality.
It's one thing to have a perfect theory of gravity. It is entirely another to watch an apple fall and hit the dirt.
That is a perfect way to put it. It is a profound transition, and arguably the most difficult maneuver the author has to make in the entire text.
Because the goal of this specific section of the book is to understand the exact hidden mechanism of moral judgment.
We are looking intimately at how the moral law impacts human psychology, and perhaps most importantly, we are drawing a sharp, unrelenting line between doing something because it is morally required and doing something simply because it feels good or happens to benefit us in the moment.
Let's quietly unpack the sheer scale of the philosopher's dilemma here, because it is staggering when you really sit with it.
It really is.
The book presents what we might call the grand problem. On one side, we have the rules of pure reason, the moral law. These rules belong to a world of freedom and pure intelligence. They are entirely immaterial.
But you and I, we live in a physical world.
Exactly. We live in a world of sense bound by rigid, unforgiving physical laws. Biology, physics, cause and effect. So the question is, how can an invisible law of freedom possibly apply to a physical action that you take in the real world?
It feels like trying to bridge two entirely incompatible universes. Imagine trying to write a computer program using the rules of poetry.
It just doesn't work.
The two systems simply do not speak the same language. The physical world only understands cause and effect. The moral world only understands freedom and duty.
So to solve this impossible translation issue, the text introduces a truly fascinating concept, which is the typic.
The typic, yes. Since we cannot literally see the moral law, you cannot put morality under a microscope, you cannot weigh goodness on a scale, we have to use the physical laws of nature as a type.
A blueprint.
Exactly, a blueprint for our imagination.
So we don't need some impossibly detailed moral rule book for every single unique situation we encounter in life. Instead, our brain has this built-in simulation engine.
The book gives us a practical rule, a sort of universalizability test. It asks you to just pause and imagine if the action you are about to take were to suddenly become a universal physical law of nature.
Like gravity.
Right. You have to ask yourself, if this action were as natural and inescapable as gravity, could the world still function?
The examples provided to illustrate this are piercing in their simplicity.
They really ground the theory. The text asks you to consider deceiving someone for personal advantage, or shortening your own life when you become thoroughly weary of it, or looking with perfect indifference upon the profound suffering of others.
Let's take that first example, deceit. If you take deceit and you run it through the test of the typic, the results are immediate. Imagine a world where deceit isn't just a bad habit that some people have, but a biological law of nature.
If everyone instinctively lied whenever it was advantageous, the very concept of truth would disintegrate.
The concept of a promise would become utterly meaningless.
Because if you make a promise in a world where everyone knows that promises are biologically designed to be broken when convenient, the words themselves lose all function. The world collapses on its own logic.
It's like if everyone agreed that counterfeiting money was totally fine and natural, within a single day, the money is just fancy paper. The logic eats itself.
Therefore, deceit fails the test.
The author argues that this is how our common sense instinctively, quietly judges right and wrong every single day, even if we never took a philosophy class. We run these little physics simulations in our heads.
But the author also throws up extremely heavy guardrails here. As we try to apply these laws, we are actively warned against two extreme, dangerous errors in our moral thinking.
Mysticism and empiricism.
Yes.
Let's look at mysticism first, which the book describes as this attempt to stretch the human imagination to literally see the invisible. It is acting as if we can pluck moral laws directly from some visible kingdom of God.
Which sounds quite poetic.
Right. But is mysticism really that dangerous? Honestly, it just sounds like harmless daydreaming, people having their heads in the clouds.
It is dangerous because it is fundamentally delusional. Think of it like trying to navigate the physical room you are sitting in right now, but you are using a map of a spiritual dimension.
You're going to walk straight into a wall.
Exactly. It is completely incompatible with human reality. However, you are right to question its threat level, because interestingly, the text doesn't view mysticism as the ultimate existential danger to morality.
Why is that?
The reason is simple. It requires far too much mental strain for the average person to maintain. Most of us simply cannot live our daily, exhausting lives with our heads perpetually lost in supersensible clouds. Reality demands our attention. We get tired. We get hungry.
So the far greater threat, the creeping rot, is empiricism.
Yes.
If mysticism is looking too far upward at the clouds and occasionally tripping, empiricism is poisoning the roots of the tree itself. From what I gather in the book, empiricism tries to base morality on feelings, on physical consequences, and on personal interests like our own happiness.
It is deeply destructive because it substitutes true duty with self-interest. It secretly teams up with our basest inclinations.
Because it's easy.
Empiricism is insidious exactly because it is so highly appealing to human nature. It flatters our desires. It whispers to you that what feels good, or what brings about a positive outcome for you and your loved ones, is inherently what is morally right.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable to most people. That is the terrifying part.
It is terrifying because it completely cuts up the morality of intentions at its very root. Imagine a society built entirely on empirical morality, a society where the only rule is to do what makes you happy or do what has the best physical outcome.
A marketplace of desires.
Exactly. In that society, the moment an act of profound cruelty results in a net gain of happiness for the majority, that cruelty becomes morally required. Empiricism turns morality into a fluctuating, unpredictable marketplace. It completely destroys the absolute, unwavering nature of duty.
And that root, the intention, is really the only thing that separates a truly good act from someone just putting on a nice show, right?
Precisely.
Which is exactly what the author means when drawing this massive, heavy line between legality and morality. Legality is merely doing the right thing. Morality is doing the right thing for the right reason.
Consider a very simple, everyday act of charity. If you donate a large sum of money to a cause so that you look good to your peers, or to get a tax write-off, or even just because it gives you a warm, pleasant feeling inside to know you helped someone.
The text categorizes that as mere legality.
Yes. It conforms to the letter of the law. You did a helpful thing, but it lacks the spirit. To have true moral worth, the action must be driven solely, unconditionally, by respect for the moral law itself. If your inner motivation was anything other than acknowledging it is your duty, your action has no moral weight.
It just completely strips away all our self-congratulations. It leaves you feeling a bit bare.
It is a harsh mirror.
And the text goes further, deeply exploring how this realization actually feels in the human mind. When we truly, honestly confront the moral law, and we realize how often our motives are entirely selfish, how does it affect us psychologically?
The author argues that human nature is inherently wired for self-regard. This introduces a concept called solipsismus.
Wait, solipsismus. That sounds incredibly close to solipsism, the philosophical idea that only my own mind exists. How does the book use it here?
It is a brilliant parallel. Here, solipsismus refers to the way we treat our own self as the absolute center of the moral universe. It is the default setting of the finite human creature.
We just instinctively put ourselves first.
Always. The text breaks this down into two distinct, interconnected parts. First is self-love, which is a sort of excessive protective fondness for oneself.
Making sure we are comfortable, fed, safe.
Right. And the second part is self-conceit, which goes a step further into pure, unadulterated arrogance. Self-conceit is the delusion that our subjective desires actually have objective value just because they're ours.
So when the absolute unyielding moral law enters the mind, it violently clashes with this solipsismus.
It is a psychological violence. The moral law thwarts our natural inclinations. It limits our self-love. It tells us we cannot just do whatever we want, but its effect on self-conceit is absolute destruction.
And strikes it down completely.
It violently strikes it down.
Yeah.
Because the moral law is absolute and universal, it reveals in an instant that all our claims to self-esteem that aren't based on moral duty are entirely vain.
So the initial effect of the moral law on a finite, selfish human mind is actually deeply negative.
Yes, it causes a profound feeling of pain and humiliation.
It is a humbling that genuinely hurts. You realize you are not the sovereign of the universe. Your desires are not sacred. But out of that exact pain, something incredibly beautiful emerges in the framework.
The space is cleared.
Exactly. By striking down our ego, by destroying our self-conceit, the moral law removes the greatest obstacle within us. And in that cleared space, the law is elevated in our minds, generating a positive, purely intellectual feeling.
Respect. The feeling of respect. The text emphasizes that this is a truly unique phenomenon in the entirety of human experience.
Yeah.
It is the only feeling we can know a priori.
Meaning, we don't have to touch a hot stove to feel it. We don't need someone to smile at us to feel it. The feeling is generated entirely by the mind itself, independently of the physical world.
Precisely. You don't need physical, real-world experience to know it exists. Every other emotion you have, joy, sadness, anger, fear, is a reaction to something happening to you in the physical world, an object of the senses.
But this feeling of respect is produced purely by an intellectual cause.
It is the feeling of our own physical, selfish nature bowing down to the invisible weight of pure reason.
And what we direct this respect toward is deeply specific, which is a boundary I find fascinating. The book makes it clear we can never feel true respect for things, only for persons.
It is a crucial boundary to draw because we often confuse respect with other powerful emotions. You might feel immense, overwhelming love for an animal like a dog or a horse. You might stand at the edge of the raging sea or at the foot of an erupting volcano, or stare up at the vast, incomprehensible magnitude of the stars and feel profound awe or terror.
But awe is not respect.
No, you do not respect a black hole or a hurricane. They are governed by blind physics. They have no choice in what they are doing.
Right. We might even feel intense admiration for a thing, or for a person's specific talents. The text mentions the philosopher Voltaire. You could admire a powerful leader, a courageous warrior, or a brilliantly witty writer. You can be absolutely astonished by their capability.
But if you learn that their core character is deeply flawed, if you find out that the brilliant writer is incredibly cruel to their family or the powerful leader is secretly corrupt,
That admiration never, ever transforms into respect.
this brings us to a beautiful defining quote the author borrows from Fontenelle. I bow before a great man, but my mind does not bow.
You can physically show deference to power, but your inner intellect remains unswayed.
And then the author takes that thought and flips it, which is the crux of the matter.
The book adds that before a humble, plain person of upright character, my mind bows whether I choose it or not.
Even if I am the wealthiest person on earth, even if I hold the highest social rank, if I stand in front of someone with undeniable, quiet, humble integrity, I feel small. I cannot help it.
And we have to ask why that happens. Why does the simple, honest baker make the corrupt king feel a pang of inward humiliation?
Because that humble person acts as a living, breathing exhibition of the moral law. They are walking proof that obedience to this heavy, difficult law is actually possible in the physical world. Seeing that immediately humbles our own pride because it removes all our excuses.
We suddenly have nowhere to hide.
We don't.
Hmm.
It is human nature to desperately look for flaws in great people, precisely to lighten the heavy burden of this humiliation. If we can prove they are flawed, if we can find a dark secret, we can excuse our own moral failures.
We say, see, nobody's perfect. Why should I try so hard?
Exactly. But when faced with true, undeniable moral character, it commands an inescapable inward respect that we simply cannot refuse.
We feel this heavy constraint, this mixture of humiliation and respect, precisely because we are finite, rational beings. We have physical bodies. We have physical needs.
We get tired, we get hungry, we get scared, we crave comfort.
Because of these deeply ingrained physical desires, the moral law will always inevitably feel like a constraint to us. It will never feel light. It will always feel like an obligation, a duty.
Because we are not divine. We do not possess what the text calls a holy will.
A holy will would automatically, effortlessly want to do good without any inner conflict whatsoever.
An angel doesn't have to force itself to be good. Goodness is its nature. But for finite humans, doing the right thing almost always involves a sacrifice of our physical inclinations. We have to actively fight our own biology and our own psychology.
Which completely reinterprets the ancient command to love God and love your neighbor. When I first read that through the framework of the book, it was a massive paradigm shift.
It is a completely different way to read it.
Because how can any law logically command you to feel an emotion? If I tell you to feel deep, passionate love for a total stranger right now, you can't simply generate a feeling on command. The text refers to that sort of passive emotion as pathological love and argues it is entirely impossible to dictate. You either feel it or you don't.
Instead, the command must be understood as practical love. It is an action, not an emotion. To love God in this philosophical framework means striving to willingly execute your duties. It means submitting to the moral law.
And to love your neighbor means actively practicing your duties toward them, regardless of how you happen to feel about them in the moment.
You do not have to like your neighbor. You do not have to feel warm fuzzies when you see them, but you are duty-bound to treat them with moral integrity.
So it is an endless, infinite striving. The ideal state where we perfectly enjoy doing our duty, where morality becomes effortless, where we achieve that holiness.
It is completely unattainable for a creature bound by physical needs.
We will never reach a point in our human lives where we have absolutely no selfish desires to overcome, but that unreachable holiness remains the ultimate target. It is the horizon we must infinitely walk toward, even knowing we will never arrive.
And ignoring that reality, believing that you have actually arrived at perfection, leads to a very specific, incredibly dangerous mindset. The text calls it moral fanaticism.
Moral fanaticism. The delusion that we can somehow transcend duty and act out of sheer, spontaneous nobility or a naturally good heart. It is the deeply arrogant belief that we have somehow outgrown the need for the strict, rigid moral law.
The analogy that always comes to mind is a highly skilled soldier in an army who suddenly decides they no longer need to follow orders or acknowledge the chain of command simply because they believe they are inherently, naturally heroic.
They step out of line, thinking their spontaneous individual actions are far superior to disciplined duty.
They think they're above the rules because their intentions are just so grand.
But the philosophy exposes this as nothing more than exaggerated self-conceit masquerading as virtue. We are subjects in the moral kingdom. We are not the sovereign. We must bear the yoke of reason, even when, and perhaps especially when, it is heavy and unglamorous.
Praising actions merely because they seem noble or magnanimous, rather than recognizing them as strictly necessary acts of duty, is a subtle poison to society.
It breeds a vain, high-flying, fantastical way of thinking.
People begin to flatter themselves. They forget that they are obligated to do these things. They start looking for merit and praise and a round of applause, rather than quietly, humbly submitting to the law they know they must follow. They want to be seen as saviors, not servants to duty.
It leaves us sitting with this beautiful, almost haunting paradox of the human condition, as presented in the book. Our supreme dignity as human beings, our ultimate worth, doesn't come from being naturally perfect.
It doesn't come from having an easy, effortless goodness where we never want to do the wrong thing.
It comes from the exact opposite. It comes from the painful, deeply humbling, yet profoundly elevating experience of submitting our unruly, selfish desires to a strict, invisible law that we freely give to ourselves.
There is a quiet, undeniable majesty to that internal struggle.
The sheer weight of realizing that our highest worth is forged in the silent, completely invisible moments where we say no to our own comforts and yes to the law of pure reason. It forces us to sit in the stillness of our own minds, feeling the sharp humiliation of our physical nature, while simultaneously feeling this profound, uplifting respect for our own moral capability, a tension that leaves us suspended in thought, waiting to see how this immense inner architecture will finally project outward into the physical world, a struggle that inevitably leads us to ask. We find ourselves at the sixth stage of our journey through the book, and we are standing right at the edge.
Right at the conceptual precipice.
Exactly. I want you to imagine you are standing on this boundary. On one side, you have the mechanical, physical universe that we can touch and measure. And on the other, this invisible, majestic reality of the moral law.
It's a heavy place to be.
It is, because it's right here that we have to confront the ultimate tension of human existence. Our mission for this segment of the book is to quietly explore this heavy, unyielding weight of moral duty. We have to look at the clash between our natural pursuit of happiness and the moral law.
And frankly, the mind-bending mystery of human freedom.
Yeah, how do we operate with free will in a universe that is otherwise governed by strict, unbreakable physical laws? We are looking at the exact mechanics of why we feel responsible for our actions and how we actually exist in two completely different worlds simultaneously.
It really is a profound transition in the text. The author begins this exploration by turning our attention to the moral teaching of the gospel. And what's so fascinating to observe is how the author thinks this teaching fundamentally shifted human perspective.
Because before this, there was a lot of indulgence in dreaming about imaginary moral perfections.
Right, these heroic ideals, which the author describes as having an insipid, almost effeminate character. It's too soft. It relies on feeling good about how great you are. The gospel, however, brought good conduct entirely under the strict discipline of duty.
It stripped away that romantic indulgence.
Completely. It set the moral law plainly before our eyes. It established absolute bounds of humility, striking down human self-conceit and the boundless arrogance of self-love.
Because self-love is constantly ready to mistake its own limits. And that sets the stage for one of the most striking, almost poetic moments in the entire book, the address to duty.
That passage is incredible.
I was reading this part, and it's delivered with this hushed, reverent fascination. The author writes of duty as a sublime and mighty name. And notice how carefully it's defined by what it does not do. Duty does not rely on charm.
No, it doesn't try to flatter you into doing the right thing.
And equally, it doesn't move your will by threatening you.
Right, it doesn't use terror or natural aversion. It simply holds forth a law that enters the mind on its own and commands immediate, reluctant reverence. Even if our natural inclinations, our desire to be comfortable or rich or safe, secretly counterwork against it, they are struck dumb in its presence.
And the author asks this beautiful question: what is the root of this noble descent? Where does this power come from that proudly rejects all kindred with our physical inclinations?
Because if it's not coming from our biology, where is it coming from?
The answer lies in what the book terms personality.
Now, we have to be careful here. This is not our colloquial sense of personality.
Right, we aren't talking about whether someone is an introvert or has a good sense of humor.
Personality, in this context, is the supreme power that elevates a human being completely above themselves as a mere part of the world of sense. It is the faculty that connects us with an order of things that only the pure understanding can conceive. It's the thing inside you that does not belong to the physical universe.
To make this relatable, the book provides this profoundly quiet example of the moderately honest man. Put yourself in this guy's shoes for a second. Imagine you are facing an intensely difficult situation.
We've all been there.
Yeah. By telling one tiny, inoffensive lie, you could instantly withdraw yourself from a highly unpleasant business. Or maybe that lie secures a significant advantage for a deeply loved, genuinely deserving friend.
And let's be clear, it's a lie that physically causes no worldly harm to anyone.
Nobody gets hurt. It just makes life easier. Yet, the man refuses the lie. He endures the pain and the distress, not because his life is pleasant, but solely so he doesn't have to despise himself secretly in his own eyes.
He's sustained by the consciousness that he has maintained the holiness of humanity within his own person.
He lives on only because it's his duty. It's completely detached from whether life is enjoyable. So what exactly is that invisible wall stopping him from telling the lie?
That wall is his recognition of himself as an end rather than a means. This brings us to a crucial pillar of the book's architecture, the absolute distinction between means and ends. In all of creation, everything we choose can be used merely as a means to an end.
You use a hammer to build a house. Use a horse to pull a cart.
But humanity is the exception. Man, and with him every rational creature, is an end in himself.
Because of that personality we just talked about.
Precisely. Because of the autonomy of our freedom, we are the subject of the moral law, which is holy. Therefore, a person can never be employed merely as a means to an end. This condition is so absolute that the book attributes it even to the divine will. Even God cannot use us merely as tools.
Okay, but if duty is this strict, if it's completely divorced from us just wanting to have a good, comfortable life, doesn't that mean the author is basically telling us we have to be miserable to be good?
It's the natural question to ask.
How does this interact with our biological desire for happiness? Does the book demand that we entirely renounce all earthly joy to achieve moral purity?
The author's clarification here is incredibly precise. The book does not demand that we renounce our claims to happiness. In fact, it argues that providing for your own happiness can actually be an indirect duty.
Wait, really? It's a duty to be happy?
An indirect duty. Think about it practically. Wealth, skill, and emotional stability give you the means to fulfill your duties to others. If you are healthy and secure, you can help your neighbor.
Oh, I see.
Conversely, the absence of happiness, like the desperation of deep poverty or the pain of sickness, contains profound temptations to transgress your duty. If you're starving, you are much more tempted to steal.
That makes perfect sense. Happiness has a practical utility in maintaining our moral fortitude.
It does. However, there is a razor-thin, absolutely vital distinction we must observe. Taking care of your happiness can never, ever be the immediate principle of duty itself. The moment duty is in question, you must take absolutely no account of happiness.
And to illustrate this, the book uses this striking analogy of medicine. Imagine trying to combine the supreme motive of duty with the charms and satisfactions of life, shaking them together to give as a mixed medicine to a sick soul.
It's a brilliant metaphor, because you might think combining the two makes the moral law easier to swallow, like hiding a bitter pill in a spoonful of sugar.
Right. But the author warns that the majesty of duty has nothing to do with the enjoyment of life. If you shake them together, they will soon separate of themselves, like oil and water.
And if they do not separate, the medicine simply won't act. Your physical life might gain some force from the sugar, but the moral life would fade away irrecoverably. You cannot taint the purity of the moral disposition at its source by making empirical happiness the driving force.
If you tell the truth because it makes you happy or rich, you aren't acting from duty.
You destroy all moral worth. Just as mixing empirical guesswork into geometry destroys the absolute certainty of mathematical principles.
This careful separation of the pure moral law from our messy physical desires leads us into a section called The Critical Examination of the Analytic of Pure Practical Reason.
A very dense title.
Incredibly dense. But the book essentially asks us to quietly observe the architecture of our own reason, contrasting practical reason with theoretical reason. Can you decode this a bit? What exactly is the difference between theoretical and practical reason here?
Let's break it down. Theoretical reason is how we understand the physical sciences. It's how we figure out how the world works. To do that, you must begin with sensible intuition. You look at a tree, you observe its leaves, you form concepts, and finally, you establish scientific principles.
You start from the outside physical world and move inward to principles.
Right. But practical reason has nothing to do with knowing external objects. Practical reason deals with your own faculty of making choices, your will. Therefore, practical reason operates in exact reverse.
It doesn't look at the world to see what is happening. It looks inside to see what ought to happen.
Exactly. It must begin with a priori principles that exist independently of any physical experience, the pure moral law.
And only after starting with that internal law can it proceed to concepts of absolute good and evil.
And concludes not with an observation of the physical world, but with a physical constraint, the feeling of respect, that quiet moral sentiment we feel when we see someone do the right thing.
To prove that human beings naturally possess this ability to separate pure duty from empirical desire, the book offers an analogy of a chemist making an experiment.
I love this visualization.
Me too. Imagine an analytical chemist who has a solution of lime and hydrochloric acid. The acid and the lime are mixed together. But when the chemist adds an alkali to the solution, the acid instantly forsakes the lime to combine with the alkali. The lime is left sitting there, completely separated.
It is a beautiful way to visualize what happens in the human mind. We can perform a conceptual experiment on an ordinary person. Take a person who is tempted to lie for physical gain. Their mind is a mixture of moral awareness and the desire for that physical advantage.
Like the acid and the lime.
Yes. Now present them with the pure moral law, the alkali. Their practical reason acts immediately. In forming a judgment of what ought to be done, their reason instantly forsakes the empirical advantage and combines intimately with truthfulness and self-respect.
The physical advantage is separated and washed away from every particle of their reason.
Now, they might still physically choose to lie out of human weakness,
They might.
but their reason inevitably recognizes the supreme worth of the moral law, cleanly distinguished from the temptation of happiness. They know with absolute chemical certainty what the right thing was.
But acknowledging that we have this pure moral law in our heads brings us to the most difficult, honestly terrifying problem in the entire book. We live in a physical world where every single event operates by a strict chain of cause and effect.
Everything is determined by a preceding event in time.
So if that is true, how can any human action ever be truly free?
This is where the text relentlessly deconstructs what it calls the wretched subterfuge of psychological freedom. Some philosophers try to evade the conflict between freedom and determinism by arguing for comparative freedom.
What does that mean, practically?
They suggest that as long as the causes of our actions are internal, our own psychological desires, our own ideas, our own memories, then we are free. They claim it doesn't matter if these causes are psychological rather than mechanical bodily movements. As long as the decision happens inside your head, you're free.
The author compares this psychological freedom to a roasting turnspit, which is quite the 18th century burn. Basically saying that claiming you're free just because your programming is inside your own head is like a clock thinking it's free because it moves its own hands without someone pushing them.
Or calling a projectile free because it's flying unhindered through the air. Whether the mechanism is moved by physical matter, which Leibniz called an automaton material, or impelled by internal ideas, an automaton spiritual, it remains a mechanism.
It's still a machine.
If our existence is entirely determinable in time, if every thought you have is just the result of the thought you had a second ago, which was the result of your childhood, which was the result of biology, then we are under the physical necessity of past conditions.
Which means when the moment comes to act, the past is no longer in our power. We're just playing out the script.
Exactly. Therefore, this so-called psychological freedom leaves absolutely no room for true transcendental freedom. True freedom, the kind required to actually hold someone morally responsible, must be entirely independent of empirical nature and the flow of time itself.
Okay, stop right there. How can we possibly be independent of time? That feels like a massive paradigm shift. Are we suddenly doing sci-fi here? How does the book get us out of that deterministic trap?
The book's solution is that we are essentially dual citizens. We exist in two different frameworks at once. Time and space only apply to things as they appear to us. The book calls these appearances phenomena. Time and space do not apply to things as they actually are in themselves, which the book calls noumena.
You have to decode those words for me. Phenomena and noumena.
Think of it like a 3D movie. Phenomena is the movie you are watching. You see characters moving through space and time on the screen. That is the physical universe we live in. But noumena is the digital code, the projector, the reality behind the illusion of the movie.
The code itself doesn't exist in the space and time of the movie screen.
We must hold these two perspectives simultaneously. As a physical being belonging to the sensible world, the world of the movie screen, your existence is phenomena. Every action is subject to time conditions and the necessity of nature.
So my body is bound by physics.
Yes. But the very same subject, you are conscious of yourself as a thing in itself, a noumenon, existing in a supersensible reality not subject to time. In this pure world of understanding, behind the movie screen, nothing is antecedent to the determination of your will.
You're not bound by the past because there is no past.
Exactly.
Let's bring this to life with the book's example of the thief, because this makes it so much clearer. Imagine a man who commits a theft. If we look at this act purely through the lens of physical causality, this deed was the strictly necessary result of determining causes in preceding time.
Given his poverty, his upbringing, the neurochemistry in his brain at that exact second, it was physically impossible that the theft could not have happened. It was inevitable.
And yet, the moral law still judges him. The moral law decrees that he ought to have left it undone. How can he be morally free and physically determined at the exact same moment? How can you blame a machine for doing what it was programmed to do?
Because, as a phenomenon in time, his act is a necessary physical event. But as a thing in itself outside of time, as a noumenon, he is the absolute author of his actions. The whole timeline of his existence as a physical being is merely the phenomenal result of his timeless choice as a noumenon.
This beautifully explains the relentless nature of human conscience. We have all tried to justify a mistake. The book notes that a man can use as much art as he likes to paint an unlawful act as a mere unintentional error.
He can say, I was carried away by the stream of physical necessity. I was tired. I was angry. I couldn't help it.
But his conscience, the accuser within, cannot be silenced. Even if the crime was committed 30 years ago, the pain and the sting of conscience remain perfectly preserved. Why doesn't conscience fade with time?
Because reason recognizes no distinction of time. Time is merely a sensible mode of representation. It's just the movie projector running. When evaluating our intelligible existence, our true self, reason looks at the event simply as our act, judging it according to the absolute spontaneity of freedom.
The life of sense, all the years you live, is viewed by your conscience as a single simultaneous phenomenon containing the manifestations of your timeless moral disposition.
That is heavy.
The author deepens this with a deeply unsettling observation about what he calls born villains. He talks about children who show early, seemingly incurable depravity.
Even with the same education that profits other kids, they continue to progress into such profound vice that society views their character as completely incapable of improvement.
Their phenomenal timeline seems hopelessly predetermined by bad genetics or a bad environment.
Yet, they are still judged for what they do. They are reproached as guilty, and they themselves regard these reproaches as well-founded. This would be entirely illogical unless we suppose that their vicious quality of will is not a blind biological necessity.
It's the consequence of evil principles, voluntarily adopted by their free, timeless causality. The character they manifest day by day in time is authored by their choice as a thing in itself outside of time.
But acknowledging this noumenal freedom, this idea that we have a self outside of time, leads us directly into the ultimate metaphysical trap raised by the book.
Right. If we are created beings, and if God created the universe, didn't God create our past? Didn't God determine the initial conditions that set the physical chain of cause and effect in motion?
If so, wouldn't we just be thinking automatons, marionettes prepared and wound up by the supreme artist?
It is an incredibly dangerous theoretical trap.
If you hold the common view that time and space are real, objective properties of things in themselves, if you think time is a fundamental reality of God's existence, then freedom is completely destroyed by the doctrine of creation.
Because if time is a necessary condition of finite things, and God is the cause of their existence, then God's causality must also be subject to time. God becomes just another link in the chain, setting up the dominoes to fall.
The author specifically calls out thinkers who try to evade this, noting they avoid the contradiction only by hiding it. But if we accept that time and space are real attributes of reality, we inevitably fall into Spinozism.
Can you explain what Spinozism is in this context?
In Spinozism, named after the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, space and time are essential attributes of the Supreme Being. In this view, God is the only actual substance that exists. You and I are not independent substances. We are merely accidents inhering in God.
Think of God as the ocean, and we are just temporary waves on the surface.
If our actions exist purely in time, and time is an attribute of God, then our actions are literally just God's actions happening in a specific place and time.
So if I steal, it's actually just God stealing through me.
Exactly. The author admits that Spinozism, despite its underlying absurdity to our moral sense, argues far more consistently than those who try to say time is real, but we somehow also have a separate creator who gave us free will. You can't have both.
So what is the solution? How does the book save our freedom without making us just waves on God's ocean?
It relies completely on that separation we discussed earlier, separating time and space from the existence of things in themselves. Time and space are merely our sensible mode of representation. They are the 3D glasses through which we view the world, not the reality of the world itself.
Therefore, the concept of creation does not apply to the sensible form of representation. God did not create appearances. God created things in themselves.
Exactly. When God created humanity, God created us as timeless, super-sensible beings. Thus, God is the cause of our existence as acting beings, as noumena.
But God is not the author of the mechanical cause and effect chain of the physical world, because the physical world of time is just how our minds process reality.
Our physical actions are subject to the mechanism of nature, but our existence itself, the core code created by God, remains entirely free.
This staggering separation is what allows the author to unlock the supersensible world using what he calls the categories of our understanding. The book explains why the concept of freedom is the only idea of pure speculative reason that possesses such immense fertility to cross over into the unknown.
But he starts talking about mathematical versus dynamical categories, and we need to translate this.
Yeah, mathematical categories like magnitude strictly require synthesis of the homogeneous. It sounds like a physics textbook. What does it mean?
Let's use a very simple example.
Like,
Think about measuring a wooden table. If you want to understand its magnitude, its length, you have to measure it using something physical, like a wooden ruler or a metal tape measure.
you are synthesizing things that are homogeneous. They share the same physical properties in space and time.
You can't measure a physical table using an invisible thought. Therefore, mathematical categories are completely trapped within the conditions of space and time. You cannot find the unconditioned, the timeless, through them.
Okay, I'm with you. Measuring physical things requires physical tools. What about dynamical categories?
Dynamical categories, specifically the concept of causality, cause and effect, do not require this homogeneity. They don't require both sides of the equation to be physical. They allow us to connect a conditionally object in the world of sense, a physical action like your hand stealing an apple, to a condition that exists entirely outside of the physical world.
Causality is the bridge. It allows us to perceive an action that is mechanically necessary in the physical world, while simultaneously attributing its origin to a causality that has no sensible condition whatsoever. It links the physical hand to the invisible, timeless choice.
And we do not merely guess at this connection. The pure practical reason provides the incontestable objective proof. The absolute weight of the moral law within us, that invisible wall that stopped the honest man from lying, is the evidence that our unconditioned causality is real.
Through the undeniable command of duty, we are positively assured that we, as beings belonging to the world of sense, also belong to the supersensible world.
The reality of this intelligible order is established not for theoretical speculation, but for practical moral certainty.
Think about what this means for your ordinary daily choices. If the author is right, if every single time you feel the sharp, undeniable sting of conscience, you're actually experiencing a transmission from a version of yourself that exists entirely outside of time and space, what does that make you Tuesday morning? You aren't just a physical machine moving through the motions of your week. Every time you choose duty over an easy lie, you are literally reaching across the boundary of the physical universe, acting as a citizen of eternity. And that brings us directly to a rather intricate juncture in the book. As we continue to carefully trace the ultimate boundaries of human reason, and as we contemplate the absolute foundation of our moral laws, we arrive at the immediate puzzle of the dialectic of pure practical reason. It's right here that the text turns our attention toward the search for the unconditioned. And ultimately, it points us toward that quiet, eternal question of human existence, the deeply complex relationship between virtue and happiness.
Yeah, that search for the unconditioned is a natural, perhaps even unavoidable movement of the human mind. The concept of the dialectic of pure reason, as it's laid out here, is something that inevitably happens because reason always demands absolute totality. Whenever our minds look at the conditions of everything we experience, we fundamentally long to find the bedrock. We want the unconditioned. We want the absolute origin or the complete chain of conditions that isn't itself dependent on anything else.
Right, we hate loose ends, essentially.
Right.
But as the book so meticulously outlines, when we apply this pure, relentless search to the sensible world, the world of physical appearances that you and I navigate every single day, an inevitable illusion arises. We begin treating these mere appearances as if they were things in themselves. Without really examining our own faculties, we just assume that this ultimate unconditioned bedrock can be found somewhere within this endless physical chain of causes and effects.
Exactly. And the author points out that this illusion would remain forever hidden if reason didn't eventually betray itself by falling into a conflict with itself. When reason applies its fundamental principle of seeking the unconditioned to mere physical appearances, it encounters stark contradictions. It hits a wall. But what is fascinating is that the text frames this conflict not as a tragic failure, but rather as the most beneficial error into which human reason could ever have fallen.
It's a subtle shift, but a really necessary one if we want to escape this paradox. You can think of it as, well, kind of like wandering into a sprawling, intricate labyrinth. At first, the sheer frustration of hitting dead end after dead end feels like a terrible mistake. You feel like you failed. But that very frustration is precisely what compels you to seek a master key. The error forces you to realize you can't just keep wandering on the ground level. You have to elevate your perspective.
I mean, that's exactly it. And when you finally find that key, it reveals a view into a higher, immutable order of things. You discover a reality you didn't even know you were looking for, but deeply needed. It forces us out of our complacent acceptance of the sensible world. This beneficial error drives us to recognize that we are already existing within that higher order, which enables us to live according to the highest dictates of reason.
But to truly live according to those dictates, practical reason has to first define its own ultimate object.
Yeah.
The book calls this the summum bonum, or the highest good. And let's unpack that specific term, because there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding the word summum that the book is incredibly careful to clear up. It identifies two distinct meanings that we have to untangle if we want to avoid needless disputes down the line.
Right, the language here is very deliberate.
Yeah, there is the supreme, which is supremum, and there is the perfect, which is consummatum.
That distinction is vital for everything that follows. The supremum is the unconditioned condition. It's the absolute original foundation that is not subordinate to anything else. The text defines this strictly as virtue, and it describes virtue as the worthiness to be happy. So virtue is the supreme condition of all that can appear to us as desirable.
But virtue alone isn't the entire picture for a rational, finite being like you or me. That's where the second meaning, consummatum, or the perfect, becomes necessary. This refers to a complete whole that is not merely a part of some greater whole. To achieve this perfect, complete good, the argument insists that happiness must also be present.
Precisely. Think about it from the perspective of a rational mind. To need happiness, to genuinely deserve it through your virtue, and yet at the same time not to participate in it, that is fundamentally inconsistent with the perfect volition of a rational being. Therefore, the summum bonum in its complete perfect sense requires both virtue and happiness existing together.
It's a lot like evaluating a sanctuary. Virtue is the absolute bedrock, the supreme foundation. You can't build a sanctuary of any worth without it. But a foundation alone is not a completed structure. A perfect whole sanctuary requires the shelter and warmth of the walls and roof, which we might liken to happiness.
That's a helpful way to visualize it.
But the book establishes a very strict, uncompromising rule here. Happiness is only considered good when it presupposes morally right behavior as its condition. Unearned happiness, or happiness born from immorality, holds absolutely no genuine worth in this framework.
Which brings us to how the ancient philosophers attempted to resolve this delicate tension between the two elements. The ancient Greek schools, specifically the Epicureans and the Stoics, recognized that virtue and happiness belong together in the conception of the highest good. But they tried to solve the connection by treating them as fundamentally identical. They sought what the text calls an analytical connection, a connection based purely on the logical law of identity.
Wait, why wouldn't that work? I mean, from a modern standpoint, wouldn't it just be simpler to say that being a good person is what makes you happy? It seems like collapsing them into one concept would save us a lot of philosophical headaches.
It's tempting, certainly, and that's exactly what the ancients tried to do. But they approached it from opposite directions, trying to collapse two completely distinct concepts into a single notion. The Epicurean view argued that prudence essentially equals morality. Their central maxim was that simply being conscious of your rational pursuit of your own happiness is virtue. They placed their defining principle entirely on the side of sense. For them, happiness was the whole highest good, and virtue was merely the rational method, the tool, really, for attaining it.
You actually see this a lot today. You might find yourself falling into this same Epicurean trap whenever you try to convince yourself that doing the right thing will ultimately be best for your career or your social standing. It's a bit like modern hustle culture, where doing good is just a networking strategy. You're trying to merge virtue with happiness by making virtue the servant of your personal success.
That's a really great modern parallel. Now, on the exact opposite side, you have the Stoic view. They argued that morality alone is true wisdom. Their maxim was the inverse. Being conscious of your virtue is happiness. They placed their principle entirely on the side of reason, advocating for total independence from all sensible desires. For the Stoic, virtue was the entire highest good, and happiness was merely the internal consciousness of possessing that virtue. You could be suffering immensely, but if you were virtuous, you were supposedly happy.
It's an elegant debate, but the book argues that both schools ultimately failed in their task. They misapplied their considerable intellect by trying to force an identity between two completely heterogeneous concepts. It's akin to trying to argue that the written recipe for a cake and the physical taste of the cake are the exact same thing, just viewed through different lenses.
I like that.
You could sit in a quiet room and analyze a recipe forever, memorizing every measurement and instruction, but you will never analytically extract the sensation of sweetness from the words on the page. They are fundamentally different elements of the whole.
That analogy captures the problem perfectly. The text makes it absolutely clear that you cannot analytically deduce happiness from the concept of virtue, nor can you logically deduce virtue from the concept of happiness. The person seeking personal happiness will not find, simply by analyzing their self-interested pursuit, that they are somehow being virtuous. And the person acting virtuously does not automatically experience physical happiness simply by being conscious of their moral conduct. Because the concepts are distinct, the unity between them cannot be analytical, it has to be synthetical.
Right. And because the connection must be synthetical, meaning there has to be a real connection of cause and effect between virtue and happiness, we run directly into the paradox that the text calls the antinomy of practical reason. If virtue and happiness must be connected as cause and effect, we are faced with two resulting propositions, and both of them appear, at least at first glance, to be entirely false.
Let's look at the first proposition. This is the idea that the desire for happiness produces virtue. The book states unequivocally that this is absolutely impossible. As established in the earlier analysis, maxims that place the determining principle of the will in the desire for personal happiness are not moral at all. You cannot found genuine virtue on the pursuit of your own personal pleasure or comfort. The selfish motive itself destroys the moral worth of the action.
So the first proposition is completely out. The direction of causality is backwards. That leaves us with the second proposition, that a virtuous mind necessarily produces happiness in the world. But the text states this is also false, though it adds a really crucial caveat. It says it is conditionally false. And the reason for this condition is grounded deeply in how the physical world actually operates.
When you exist in the sensible world, the physical world of appearances, the practical connection of causes and effects is dictated purely by the mechanism of nature. Physical outcomes depend on physical laws, on knowing those laws and having the physical power to utilize them for your purposes. The physics of the world do not depend in any way upon the moral dispositions of your inner will.
As anyone who has ever gotten a flat tire on their way to do volunteer work knows, the laws of physics aren't particularly impressed by your good intentions. Being profoundly good doesn't magically manipulate the physical reality of the universe. The universe doesn't bend its natural laws to reward a virtuous person with physical safety or comfort. A perfectly moral person is still subject to illness, misfortune, and the mechanical, indifferent forces of nature. So, if we consider our existence solely within this sensible world, expecting a necessary, guaranteed connection between our virtue and our physical happiness is completely unfounded.
This is exactly where the book introduces its resolution. To escape this labyrinth, this antinomy, we have to acknowledge the duality of human existence. The text reminds us that we do not merely exist as appearances in the sensible world, bound forever by the rigid mechanism of physical laws. We also exist as noumena, as pure intelligence, within an intelligible world.
It's a quiet shift in perspective, but it changes everything. In the sensible world, we are mere appearances, subject to the endless chain of natural cause and effect. But simultaneously, we belong to an intelligible world, a realm entirely free from the laws of nature, where our will can be determined by pure intellectual principles, by the moral law itself.
Because we possess this duality, the second proposition of the antinomy that a virtuous mind produces happiness is only conditionally false. It is false if, and only if, we assume our existence in the sensible world is our only mode of existence. But because you are justified in thinking that you exist also as a noumenon in a world of the understanding, it becomes entirely possible that the morality of your mind can have a necessary connection as a cause with happiness as an effect.
Not immediately, of course. You don't alter the physical laws around you simply by willing purely. The text carefully specifies that this connection happens mediately, through an intelligent author of nature. Through our necessary connection to the intelligible realm, the realization of the summum bonum becomes practically possible. Morality remains the supreme good, the foundation, and happiness is its morally conditioned but necessary consequence within a supersensible relation of things.
Interestingly, the author notes how strange it is that philosophers, both ancient and modern, have often persuaded themselves that they could find happiness in accurate proportion to virtue entirely within this present sensible life. The text actually offers a nuanced defense of Epicurus here, noting he wasn't as base in his practical precepts as some might assume. He included the moderation and control of inclinations in his scheme of pleasure. He even reckoned the most disinterested practice of good among the ways of enjoying intimate delight.
Yet Epicurus still fell into a subtle trap. He made this pleasure the motive, which the book argues we must rightly refuse to do. He presupposed a virtuous disposition in the person before providing the springs to virtue. But as the argument goes, How can you make someone virtuous in the first instance by praising the peace of mind that comes from integrity if they don't already have a sense for that integrity? You can't use the resulting peace of mind as the bait to create the virtue. It just doesn't work that way.
And as we hold this intricate, delicate balance between duty and the satisfaction it brings, the text warns us of a very subtle psychological phenomenon. It discusses what it calls videum subreptionis. This is an optical illusion of the inner sense. It's an illusion that even the most experienced reflective minds cannot always easily avoid.
To put it in everyday terms, it's like volunteering at a soup kitchen because it gives you a warm glow, but tricking yourself into believing you did it purely out of a sense of moral duty. You're mistaking the pleasant side effect for the main motivation. This illusion occurs when we mistake the feeling of satisfaction that follows a moral action for the actual motive of the action itself. When your will is determined directly by the moral law, out of pure reason, it naturally produces a feeling of satisfaction or pleasure in the resulting action. But the illusion tempts us to look at this internal state and mistakenly assume that the desire for this pleasant feeling was what impelled us to act in the first place.
The book is incredibly careful to distinguish the true spring of moral action. Respect for the law is not a feeling of pleasure or a pursuit of happiness. It is a purely practical, intellectual determination. But because this purely rational determination has the exact same effect in impelling us to activity as a feeling of expected pleasure would have, we easily confuse what we actively do with what we passively feel. We mistake the moral spring for a sensible impulse.
The text calls it a sublime illusion. And it is kind of awe-inspiring when you think about it, that human nature can be determined to actions immediately by a purely rational law, without needing a physical bribe. It's beautiful that this intellectual capacity can almost mimic a sensible feeling. But we have to remain vigilant. We have to beware of falsely extolling this moral principle by saying we act for the pleasant feeling it produces. Doing so degrades and disfigures the genuine spring of morality. True moral action must be done from duty, out of pure respect for the law, not merely in accordance with duty, just to secure a pleasant internal sensation.
To further clarify this, the text offers a specific term for this resulting internal state: self-contentment. It clarifies that this is absolutely not happiness, which relies on the positive satisfaction of sensible desires. Rather, it is an intellectual contentment. It's a negative satisfaction. You feel contented because you are purely conscious of your freedom, your mastery over your inclinations, and your independence from them. Sensible contentment, as the author notes, is impossible to truly achieve because our inclinations are inherently burdensome. They change constantly. They grow the more we indulge them, always leaving behind a still greater void than we initially thought to fill. A rational being inevitably wishes to be completely rid of these ever-shifting, burdensome inclinations. Even feelings of compassion and tender sympathy, if they precede the deliberation on duty and become the determining principle, can bring confusion to a right-thinking person.
Intellectual contentment, on the other hand, comes purely from the consciousness of following the moral law with unyielding resolution, holding oneself free from the influence of those sensible wants. It's an enjoyment analogous to the self-sufficiency of the Supreme Being, resting on no special sensible feeling at all, but only on the consciousness of inner freedom. This clear, uncompromising elevation of moral duty over all sensible inclinations leads directly to the text's vital discussion on the primacy of pure practical reason. The text explains that whenever two faculties of the mind are connected, one must have primacy. It defines primacy as the prerogative to be the first determining principle in the connection. It's the core interest to which the other must inevitably subordinate itself.
We possess these two distinct faculties with two distinct interests. Speculative reason seeks cognition of objects, constantly pushing its understanding up to the highest a priori principles. Practical reason, conversely, seeks the determination of the will toward a final, complete end. When these two pure faculties are combined in one cognition, a clear hierarchy has to be established to avoid endless internal conflict.
Think of your mind as having two departments. You have the science department, which is your speculative reason. It deals with facts, cognition, understanding how things work. And then you have the HR department, your practical reason, which deals with purpose, morals, and determining your will. The text is basically saying that when there's a tie, the HR department gets the final say. Speculative reason must accept the a priori principles of practical reason, even if those practical propositions transcend the limits of speculative insight. As long as these practical propositions don't actively contradict speculative reason, the science department has to take them up, try to connect them with its own concepts, and treat them as an extension of its employment in a completely different aspect.
It's a profound subordination. And one might wonder, why must speculative reason bow to the practical? Why can't speculative reason obstinately follow its own separate interests and reject anything it can't prove with manifest examples and physical experience? The book explains that if practical reason were merely regulating our inclinations based on the sensible principle of happiness, we could never ask speculative reason to accept its dictates. That would be akin to surrendering our rational faculties to wild imaginations, like the mystical dreams or theosophical visions the text warns against.
But because pure reason is actually practical of itself, a fact proven by our unavoidable consciousness of the moral law, it is ultimately one and the same reason judging from different viewpoints. If speculative and practical reason were merely co-equal, they would constantly war over their boundaries, closing their borders to one another. But all interest of the mind is ultimately practical. Even the interest of speculative reason is conditional, and it only finds its absolute complete fulfillment in its practical employment. Because at the end of the day, our ultimate goal as humans isn't just to know things, but to figure out how to act.
And as we hold on to this realization that practical reason determines our ultimate pursuit, we must look at the exact requirement for realizing the summum bonum in the world. The text establishes that the supreme condition of this highest good is the perfect accordance of the human mind with the moral law.
This perfect, unwavering accordance is what the text defines as holiness. It is an absolute alignment of the will with moral perfection. Yet the argument leaves us with a stark and intensely quiet realization to ponder. This state of holiness is a perfection of which no rational being in the sensible world is capable at any single, solitary moment of their existence.
Turning the page right into the dense, profound architecture of Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason, we find ourselves just continuing this unraveling of the absolute limits of human thought. We're tracing the very blueprints of our moral universe in this book and this specific section.
It confronts us with three really monumental pillars of philosophy.
Right. We are looking at the necessity of the immortality of the soul, the existence of God, not as some provable scientific fact, but as a strict moral requirement, and ultimately how our internal, quiet sense of duty manages to achieve what theoretical science simply cannot touch.
Let's start by unpacking this concept Kant calls the summum bonum, which translates to the highest good.
Okay, the highest good.
He argues that the absolute first indispensable element of this highest good is complete and perfect accordance with the moral law. He uses the word holiness for this state.
But reading that in the book, I find myself stumbling a bit. Flawless, absolute holiness for humans, that feels like setting a bar so high we are guaranteed to fail before we even begin.
It does feel that way. And that tension is entirely intentional. Kant recognizes that this definition creates an immediate massive problem for us. Think about what we are as finite beings. We possess rationality, which is remarkable, but we are heavily flawed.
We're anchored to physical desires, earthly limitations.
Exactly. Constant internal conflicts. The idea of complete, unyielding holiness, a state where your will is perfectly, seamlessly aligned with the moral law without a single ounce of internal resistance or hesitation, is entirely impossible for us to achieve within the brief, fragile span of a human life.
So it's almost like trying to reach the top of an endless mountain. I kept picturing a mathematical asymptote while reading this book. You know, that curve on a graph that constantly gets closer and closer to a straight line.
Reaching out into infinity, but it never actually touches it.
Right. We can climb this mountain, and with every step, the peak just seems to grow taller. We can continuously make progress, moving away from our worst tendencies towards something morally better, refining our character day by day. But we never truly arrive at that summit of perfect holiness where we can just sit down and say, I'm done. I'm perfectly good.
That visual of the asymptote captures the mechanics of his argument perfectly.
Ah.
Because the moral law is inflexible. It doesn't care about our limitations. It commands us, unequivocally, to reach that highest good.
And a core tenet of practical reason is that if we are commanded to do something by our own moral duty, it must actually be possible to do it. The universe cannot demand the impossible.
Precisely. But since it is demonstrably, physically impossible to achieve perfect holiness in our short, finite 80 or so years on this planet, practical reason absolutely demands the immortality of the soul.
Wait, I really want to make sure I'm following this logic because it feels like a massive leap. Kant is saying that we have to assume we live forever purely because we can't achieve perfection right now. It's almost like saying the teacher gave us an assignment so long that the school day simply must be infinite so we can finish the homework.
It is a profound leap, yes, but within his framework, it is entirely logically sound. If it takes an eternity to achieve the perfection the moral law requires, then we must postulate, we must assume as a necessary condition, an endless duration of our existence. If we don't assume this endless progression, Kant warns that we fall into two incredibly dangerous psychological traps regarding how we live our lives.
Right, the first trap he mentions is degrading the law. If I believe this short, fleeting life is all I have, and I know for a fact I can't reach perfect holiness before I die, the natural human temptation is to just lower the bar,
We start making the moral law more lenient.
softening its strictness to fit our convenience, our exhaustion, our weaknesses. We shrug and tell ourselves, well, I'm only human, and we water down the demands of duty until they aren't really demands at all, just gentle suggestions.
Lowering the bar is the most common default. But the second trap is equally dangerous, perhaps even more so in a philosophical sense. Kant calls it fanaticism, or losing oneself in theosophic dreams.
Theosophic dreams.
This happens when a person falsely convinces themselves that they actually can attain perfect divine holiness right now in this physical life.
Like a kind of toxic moral positivity, pretending you've conquered all human flaw.
It is a complete contradiction of basic self-knowledge. To claim you have achieved absolute moral perfection ignores the reality of your constant internal struggles and the physical conditions of being human. It strains your expectations toward a delusional goal.
So both of these traps, either making the law too easy to excuse your flaws or pretending you are already perfect to stroke your ego, they both completely hinder the genuine, unceasing effort that is actually required to obey a strict, inflexible command of reason.
I see you're getting it. You have to accept the endless journey to keep yourself honest.
But here's the part of the book that really made me pause. We are trapped in time, right? We experience this striving as a slow, endless, sometimes agonizing succession of moments. One good choice, one bad choice, day after day. But Kant introduces the perspective of the infinite being, of God.
Who is not bound by the condition of time.
Right. So to audibly, being outside of time, this endless, infinite striving of the human soul isn't seen as a frustrating, incomplete process. God doesn't watch us frame by frame. He sees this endless progression as a single, completed whole. He sees our unwavering firmness of mind, our commitment to the journey over an eternity, as an intellectual intuition of our entire existence.
Which is a remarkably beautiful way to reconcile our finite struggle with an infinite demand. And if we follow that thread, it transitions us seamlessly into the second necessary element of the summum bonum.
The highest good isn't just about being perfectly moral.
No, it is about virtue being perfectly matched with proportionate happiness. But when you look at the physical world around you, when you really observe nature, there is a cruel, undeniable disconnect. Being a fundamentally good person does not naturally guarantee that you will be happy or safe.
It really doesn't. But reading this, it felt exactly like playing a tabletop role-playing game where you are the game master of your own internal actions. You entirely control how strictly you follow the rules of morality. You agonize over the tough choices, you do the right thing when it's hard, but you have absolutely zero power over the distribution of the prize at the end.
You have no control over the physical mechanics of the universe that dispense happiness or suffering.
Physical nature operates blindly. A falling rock or a sudden illness doesn't pause to check your moral alignment before it strikes. It doesn't care if you are a saint or a sinner. You could roll a perfect 20 in morality and still get crushed by the boulder of physical reality.
That visceral unfairness you are describing is the exact friction Kant is addressing. And this disconnect is why he says we must postulate the existence of God. It isn't a scientific discovery. It is a logical necessity driven by our own internal moral duty. We are duty-bound to pursue the highest good. Therefore, we must believe that the exact harmony of perfect morality and perfect happiness is actually structurally possible in the grand scheme of things.
Because if it's not possible, the whole moral enterprise feels like a cruel joke.
And since physical nature itself is entirely indifferent, since it operates on gravity and biology, not justice, it cannot guarantee this harmony. So, our reason forces us to postulate a supreme cause outside of physical nature. We must assume the existence of a cosmic guarantor who has the power to harmonize physical nature with moral character.
And this supreme cause can't just be some blind cosmic energy field. Kant insists it must be an intelligence with a will. It has to be a being capable of deeply understanding the conception of moral laws.
Capable of judging the deeply hidden moral character of rational beings, seeing past our actions to our actual intentions, and possessing the will and the absolute power to dispense happiness in exact proportion to that internal moral worth.
It requires an architect of justice, not just an architect of physics.
We do have to be incredibly careful with how we frame this belief, though. Kant is meticulously, almost obsessively careful in this book to clarify that assuming the existence of God is a subjective moral necessity. He calls it a pure rational faith. It is not an objective duty.
Can you break that down for me, the difference between a subjective moral necessity and an objective duty?
Think of an objective duty as something you are morally required to do, like telling the truth or not harming others. You cannot have a duty to simply suppose the existence of something. You can't be ordered to believe a fact. That belongs to the realm of theoretical science, of proving things with evidence, not morality. Furthermore, and this is crucial, we are not good because God tells us to be.
Because if we only acted well out of fear of divine punishment, or because we were hoping for a VIP ticket to heaven, it ruins the whole thing.
It destroys it completely. Acting out of fear or transactional hope would obliterate the autonomy of our free will. And free will is the very foundation of his entire moral philosophy. We don't derive our morals from God. We derive our need for God from our morals.
That distinction is so quiet, yet so profound. We believe in God because our unyielding, autonomous commitment to being good requires a universe where goodness ultimately matters. We need to know the scales are eventually balanced, otherwise our rationality fractures. So I have to ask, how did other philosophers handle this before Kant? Did anyone else figure this out? Because reading his critiques of the ancient Greeks, it seems like he thought they missed the mark completely.
They did, in opposite directions. He provides a fascinating philosophical scorecard evaluating how past schools of thought failed the test of the summum bonum. Let's look at the Epicureans first. They completely collapsed the system by making happiness the supreme principle. For them, morality was just a tool, reduced to mere human prudence.
So they basically said the ultimate good is just maximizing your own comfort, like the ultimate treat yourself philosophy, where being a good person is only useful if it helps you secure a stress-free life.
Yes, and by making happiness the ultimate goal, they degraded the entire concept of duty. Duty became arbitrary. Then you have the Stoics, who swung the pendulum entirely in the opposite direction. They correctly identified virtue as the supreme condition of the highest good. But their execution was deeply flawed, leading to a kind of psychological denial.
Because they claimed that perfect virtue was attainable right now in this physical life, which, as we established with the whole endless mountain analogy, stretches human limits to the breaking point. But didn't they also claim that a wise person shouldn't even care about being happy?
They did. They denied that personal happiness was a necessary separate desire. They constructed this image of a perfectly wise man who was essentially like a divinity, utterly unaffected by the physical evils of the world. Imagine someone claiming they are perfectly content and untouched while their house burns down or they're suffering a terrible illness.
It just doesn't align with reality.
Kant argues this contradicts the very voice of our own human nature. We do desire happiness, and we are inherently vulnerable to physical suffering. Pretending otherwise is absurd.
Which is why Kant ends up contrasting these Greek schools with Christian doctrine. And it's interesting, he seems to be setting aside its religious, dogmatic authority and just looking at it purely as a philosophical structure. When you view it that way, he argues that it perfectly satisfies the strict demands of practical reason.
It manages to balance the scales that the Greeks tipped over. It demands true, unyielding holiness. It doesn't let us off the hook like the Epicureans, but it pairs that strict demand with the recognition of our constant propensity for transgression. It blends our self-esteem, our consciousness of our firm purpose to be good, with a deep grounding humility about our very real flaws. It acknowledges we are on an infinite path.
And crucially, it promises that second element, happiness, but not in this physical life. It places that perfect harmonization of nature and morality in eternity, overseen by a holy author. I love how this section of the book encapsulates the idea that morality is never ever an instruction manual on how to become happy. It's not a life hack. Morality is strictly the instruction on how to become worthy of happiness.
Worthy of happiness. That is the crux of it. Which brings up an ultimate sweeping question about creation itself. If you were to ask what God's ultimate purpose was in creating the world, you cannot just say the happiness of rational beings. Kant argues that a supreme independent wisdom wouldn't create a vast, complex universe based merely on blind goodness or a simple desire to see creatures comfortable.
So the universe isn't a theme park designed for our entertainment and comfort.
Far from it. God's ultimate end is the summum bonum itself. It is happiness strictly and relentlessly conditioned by the worthiness to be happy. God's glory isn't some anthropomorphic desire to be praised by us. His glory is realized precisely through the existence of the most estimable thing in the universe. Our free, autonomous respect for his moral commands, crowned eventually by a happiness that matches that beautiful moral order.
And realizing that brings us to this quietly radical takeaway for you listening right now. Because you are a subject of this holy moral law, because you possess this autonomy and free will, you are an end in yourself. Humanity can never be used merely as a means to an end, not by other people, and not even by God. Humanity must be holy to ourselves because our capacity to freely choose the moral law is the very foundation of the universe's highest good. It elevates human dignity to a cosmic level.
It does. But as sweeping and cosmic as this sounds, we must remember how strictly Kant guards this moral territory from the overreach of science and speculative reason. He issues a profound warning here. He tells us that these postulates we've discussed, immortality, freedom, and God, do not extend our theoretical or scientific knowledge. We haven't just proven God exists in a way a physicist could measure. We cannot suddenly put the soul under a microscope or mathematically map the empirical nature of the afterlife.
He uses this haunting phrase to describe what happens if we try. He warns that if we try to apply the categories of our scientific understanding to these ideas without any sensible physical intuition, we turn theology into a magic lantern of chimeras. A magic lantern being those early, antique slide projectors. We basically just project pure, fantastical illusions onto the wall of our minds and falsely call it scientific knowledge.
To avoid projecting those chimeras, we have to strip away all anthropomorphism when we think of God. Anthropomorphism meaning all our human psychological limitations. We have no choice but to use words like understanding and will to describe the supreme being because that is the limit of our language. But we have to realize our human understanding is discursive.
Discursive meaning it happens in a sequence, right? Like watching a movie frame by frame. We figure things out over time.
Yes, moving from premise to conclusion. But God's understanding cannot be bound by time. It must be an immediate, timeless intuition. He sees the whole film strip at once. Similarly, our human will is dependent on the satisfaction of our desires, on reacting to what we lack. God's will is entirely independent. Kant warns that we only retain just enough of these concepts of understanding and will to make the moral law possible in our minds. We strip away everything else so we don't accidentally create a God made in our own limited, flawed image.
And this is exactly why why looking at the physical universe can never actually prove the existence of God. I mean, you can look through a telescope at the staggering complexity of the stars, the orbit of planets, the intricate order of biology, and you might logically conclude there is a remarkably powerful, incredibly wise architect who built it all.
But an architect is not a God. From observing a tiny, limited fraction of one single universe, you can never scientifically infer an all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite, eternal being. To scientifically prove an absolutely perfect creator, you would need to be omniscient yourself. You would need to be able to observe and compare all possible worlds to know this one was made by infinite perfection. Physics gives you an impressive designer. It does not and cannot give you an infinite God.
So morals triumph exactly where physics reaches its boundary. The concept of an infinite God belongs strictly and exclusively to the realm of morals. It is only our internal, practical demand for perfect internal justice, our deep need for a universe where the highest good is structurally possible, that requires an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and eternal being.
Kant points out that even the ancient Greeks only arrived at a pure rational theology when they stopped looking outward at nature and started looking inward at morals. Philosophers like Anaxagoras didn't find the supreme being by observing the weather or the tides or the stars. They found it when they realized that the profound, unyielding demands of human morality required a rational cause possessing all perfection. The speculative reason of science merely played the role of a spectator, stepping in later to embellish a concept that had actually grown entirely in the quiet, rich soil of moral duty.
Which leaves you with this deeply stirring, almost unsettling realization. When you strip away all the noise of the physical world, all the science and stars and the mechanisms of nature, it is simply your own internal, quiet sense of duty, your pure practical reason. That is the only bridge. It is the only thing within you capable of reaching past the boundaries of the physical universe, stretching out in the dark to actually touch the concepts of eternity and a supreme being.
It forces a profound meditation. Sitting with the realization that our minds, as fragile, flawed, and terrifyingly finite as they are, somehow contain a moral law so impossibly vast, so demanding of an absolute perfection that it literally requires an infinite universe and an endless duration of time just to hold it. So, as you move into this 9th segment of our exploration, you really start to feel this profound shift in the architecture of the philosophy.
You do?
Because up until now, we've been suspended in these massive objective frameworks, duty and reason. But stepping into this section, the gaze just turns completely inward. We are suddenly dealing with the subjective reality of the human mind.
Right, looking closely at how these monumental concepts of morality are actually woven into our living, breathing psychology.
It's an intimate shift.
It is, and it's a necessary pivot. The architecture of morality is, well, it's useless if we don't understand how the machinery operates inside the individual.
Yeah.
The book begins this inward turn by addressing the postulates of pure practical reason. And right at the center of that is a rather daunting concept, the summum bonum, or the highest good.
I found myself really pausing over that term. The highest good.
It carries a lot of weight.
It does. And the argument presented is that humans are inherently driven to seek it, this ultimate state where virtue and happiness are perfectly proportioned.
Perfectly balanced.
Right. But there's this massive friction point introduced almost immediately. Because if we just look around at the physical world, the mere course of nature, there is absolutely no guarantee of this highest good.
None at all.
Bad people thrive, good people suffer. Speculative reason, our logical observation of the physical world, it can't prove that a perfectly just design or a God exists.
It's silent on that front.
Exactly. So if we can't prove it by looking at nature, isn't striving for this highest good just an empty exercise?
And that is the exact paradox this section is trying to resolve. If you rely purely on observing the mechanics of the natural world, any inference about a perfect, definite cause remains entirely uncertain.
It's just guessing.
Essentially, yes. Speculative reason can only offer a highly rational opinion at best. But the crucial distinction made here is that while speculative reason cannot prove it, practical reason absolutely demands it.
Demands it because of duty.
Right, precisely. It is not a demand born out of some casual desire for things to be fair. It is an inexorable duty. You're bound by the moral law to make the highest good the object of your will.
Mm-hmm.
And logically, if you are commanded to pursue a target, you must suppose that the target is actually possible to hit.
Right. Otherwise, the command is absurd.
Exactly. Because you have an absolute duty to pursue the highest good, you are forced to postulate the conditions that allow it to exist, meaning God, freedom, and immortality.
But wait, how do we defend that from just being extreme wishful thinking?
It's a fair question.
Because, if I desperately want something to be true and I convince myself it must exist so I can pursue it, isn't that just a delusion? There's a specific analogy brought up here from a thinker named Wiseman that illustrates this perfectly.
Ah, yes. The hallucinated lover.
Right, it's about a man deeply in love who hallucinates this ideal, beautiful partner, a total phantom of his own brain. And because he is so obsessed with this phantom, he tries to argue that she must actually exist somewhere out there in the world.
Wiseman's analogy is brilliant because it captures the exact trap of human psychology. And the book entirely agrees with him when it comes to personal desires.
It calls it foolishness, right?
It does. If you argue that something exists simply because your inclinations desperately want it to, that is foolishness. But we have to separate personal inclination from moral necessity.
A requirement of inclination is just a wish.
Yes. A requirement of pure reason, on the other hand, is a structural necessity. The moral law does not care about your subjective romantic wishes or your desire for comfort. It binds you objectively.
It's completely indifferent to what we happen to want.
Completely. Therefore, assuming the existence of God and immortality isn't some fantasy constructed to make us feel better about a cruel world. It is the required foundation to fulfill an absolute command.
So it frames this assumption as a rational faith. But what really caught my attention is the caveat that comes with it. This rational faith is not a command. You cannot be ordered to believe in the highest good.
You can't command belief, because belief belongs to the realm of judgment, not action. The moral law commands your actions. It tells you what you must do.
But the belief itself has to be free.
Right. Theoretical reason leaves the exact mechanism of the universe's ultimate design slightly open. And into that open space, your moral interest steps in and ticks the scales. It is a voluntary determination.
You choose to assume these postulates because they harmonize perfectly with the moral disposition of your mind.
Yes.
Which brings up this fascinating hypothetical scenario. If this rational faith requires an element of choice, an element of obscurity, what would happen if that obscurity was removed?
That is a terrifying thought experiment.
It really is. What if nature had simply given us absolute, undeniable proof of God and eternity?
Yeah.
Imagine if absolute divine majesty and judgment stood visibly, unceasingly before our eyes.
If we run that thought experiment through the lens of human psychology, the result is actually quite chilling. We are creatures heavily driven by inclination, we naturally seek pleasure, and we shrink from pain.
Instinctively.
Right. So if eternity and absolute infallible judgment were standing visibly right in front of us, the terror of punishment and the desire for reward would entirely hijack our minds.
Transgression would practically cease to exist. Every single person would follow the law perfectly.
Outwardly, yes, we would follow the law flawlessly. But think about the internal motivation. We would only be acting out of absolute fear, or perhaps a calculating, self-serving hope.
We would never do it out of pure duty.
Never. Under those conditions, the moral worth of our actions would instantly vanish. True duty requires a vacuum of absolute certainty. It requires the space for you to choose the moral law for its own sake, independent of an overwhelming external threat.
There's this incredibly vivid metaphor used in the book to describe that exact state. If we had undeniable proof, human conduct would turn into a mere mechanism. We would become like actors in a puppet show.
A puppet show, yes.
The strings would be pulled by this overwhelming external reality. We would gesticulate perfectly, hitting all our marks, doing exactly what the law requires, but there would be no life in the figures.
No internal moral worth driving the action.
Just a world of perfect behavior, entirely devoid of genuine morality. It's such a striking image, and it leads to a really profound realization about the human condition. The very thing we constantly complain about.
Our obscure, doubtful view of the future.
Exactly. The fact that we can only conjecture about the mysteries of the universe rather than behold them, clearly it's actually a necessary gift.
It is the precise condition required for genuine moral disposition. The darkness is what gives you the breathing room to choose the light simply because it is the right thing to do.
So if our natural lack of absolute proof is actually a gift that allows for free will, the next logical hurdle is entirely practical. How do we actually teach people to use that free will properly?
Yes, moving from the objective to the subjective.
How do we take these grand objective laws of pure practical reason and get them to genuinely influence the human mind?
That is the transition into the methodology. We are looking at the eternal challenge of character building. There is this deeply ingrained temptation in society to get people to behave by promising them pleasure or threatening them with pain.
We use these psychological leading strings of advantage and loss.
We do. But if you rely on those methods, you only ever create what is called legality.
Meaning they follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit.
Exactly. You get outward conformity, but you breed internal hypocrisy. People learn to act correctly while remaining internally worthless, constantly scanning for their own hidden advantage.
True morality requires acting from the spirit of the law.
Yet skeptics often argue that pure virtue, just the raw concept of duty, cannot possibly be a stronger motivator than the immediate allurements of pleasure or the threat of pain.
But the book argues that a receptivity to pure moral interest is already hardwired into us. And it uses this incredibly relatable observation to prove it. It describes what we might call the dinner party phenomenon.
Such a keen observation.
Right. Imagine a mixed company. Business people, scholars, everyday folks just sitting around a table. Eventually the jokes run dry, the stories are exhausted, and the conversation naturally pivots. And what do they pivot to?
They start arguing about the moral worth of someone's actions.
Yes. It is a masterful observation because it highlights something universal. Even people who absolutely despise dry, theoretical philosophy suddenly become incredibly sharp and hyper-analytical when judging character.
They do.
You see this constantly today, especially if you look at how society reacts to a public scandal or a celebrity apology video. Millions of people suddenly turn into forensic psychologists.
Dissecting every motive.
Dissecting every microexpression, scrutinizing every word choice, searching for any hidden selfishness that might taint the purity of the apology or the action. People will fiercely debate whether a philanthropic donation was done out of true goodness or just for a tax write-off and good PR.
That modern equivalent is spot on. Some will strictly defend the person's purity of purpose, while others will cynically tear it down. But the underlying argument remains the same. This universal human propensity.
This deep, almost obsessive pleasure we take in evaluating moral purity.
Yes. It proves that the concept of pure virtue inherently captivates the human mind. We are wired to care deeply about the motive behind the action.
If we have this natural propensity to analyze moral purity, it raises a huge red flag about how we typically educate our youth.
Right.
Why do we feed children what the book describes as sentimental romances?
That is a critical point of friction. The tradition of using sentimental narratives filled with overly dramatic, super meritorious, or noble actions is fiercely dismantled here.
It just completely tears it down.
Because when you present children with heroes who always act out of an overflowing emotional greatness of soul, you aren't actually teaching them duty. You are teaching them to rely on fleeting ebullitions of feeling.
You're turning them into fantastical romancers. They end up waiting for some grand wave of emotion to carry them into doing a good deed, rather than building the quiet, steady discipline of principle.
And to truly educate a youth, you have to strip away the emotional grandstanding.
And there is a specific thought experiment laid out to prove this, designed for a 10-year-old boy. Let's walk through the escalation of it, because the stakes are incredibly high.
The careful escalation is what makes the experiment work. You introduce the boy to a story about an honest man. This man is approached by a powerful monarch, say Henry VIII, and ordered to slander an innocent, powerless person like Anne Boleyn.
Okay.
First, the man is offered massive bribes, great gifts, high rank, and he rejects them. At this stage, the 10-year-old boy hears this and feels simple approval.
Simple approval, yeah. But then the threats begin. The monarch turns the man's best friends against him. His close family threatens to disinherit him. Powerful politicians start persecuting him everywhere he goes.
The pressure mounts.
The prince threatens him with the loss of his freedom and ultimately the loss of his life.
And the scenario pushes even further into the deepest psychological pain. We are told to conceive of this man's family, threatened with extreme starvation and distress, begging him on their knees to just yield and tell the lie.
God, imagine that.
Imagine this man, who is not calloused or unfeeling, who feels deep compassion for his family and intense agony over his own suffering, wishing he had never lived to see this terrible day. And yet,
He remains entirely unyielding.
entirely, he holds fast to his uprightness of purpose without a single moment of wavering.
When you test that escalating nightmare on a 10-year-old boy, his reaction shifts dramatically. It moves from simple approval to admiration to absolute amazement, and finally to a profound veneration.
He feels a lively wish that he could be such a man.
Even though he certainly wouldn't want to be in those agonizing circumstances. And the crucial takeaway here is that virtue is valued so highly by the human mind because it costs so much.
If there was any hidden profit, any secret advantage the man was hoping to gain, the admiration of the boy would instantly collapse. The veneration rests entirely on the absolute purity of the moral principle.
It is the raw respect for the law, stripped of all happiness, comfort, and emotional reward. That is what has the most penetrating influence on the soul.
To anchor this point, there is a piece of poetic wisdom incorporated from the ancient Roman poet Juvenal. He talks about being brought before the torturous bronze bull of Phalaris.
A literal instrument of execution where victims were roasted alive inside a brazen bowl.
Yes, and Juvenal writes that even if you are commanded to lie with the bronze bull right in front of you, roaring with fire, you must believe it is the highest impiety to prefer your physical life to your moral reputation.
To lose the very causes of living, merely to stay alive.
It is a devastatingly clear articulation of pure duty. When you postpone everything, even your own survival, to the holiness of duty alone, you elevate yourself above the entire world of sense.
But how do we actually cultivate that level of resolve? The philosophy outlines a specific three-stage method for moral cultivation. It takes that raw awe and systemizes it into lived reality.
Let's break down those 3 stages. Stage 1 is about building the habit of judgment.
Taking that analytical energy we talked about with the dinner party and applying it systematically.
Exactly. Making it a natural reflex to look at an action and ask, does this conform objectively to the moral law? And more importantly, distinguishing true essential obligations from mere non-essential duties.
You are essentially sharpening the mind's ability to categorize moral reality. Once that habit of precise judgment is formed, you advance to stage 2, which involves recognizing the beauty of virtue.
When we analyze moral correctness, we experience a very specific type of intellectual satisfaction. The comparison made here is to the joy of scientific observation. There is a wonderful historical anecdote brought up about the philosopher Leibniz.
The story of the microscopic insect. Leibniz was observing this tiny, seemingly insignificant insect under a microscope. After examining its incredibly complex, perfect organization, he gently placed it back on its leaf, deliberately sparing its life.
Because he felt he had received a genuine benefit from it.
Right, because observing its physical order enriched his understanding of the universe.
We experience a remarkably similar joy when we observe the pure order of moral actions. We find deep satisfaction in seeing human reason determine what ought to be done, entirely independent of animal instinct.
It gives virtue a form of structural beauty.
But this beauty is still somewhat detached. It is an observation. That leads us to the final elevation, stage 3, inner freedom.
This is where it gets deeply personal.
Huh.
In this third stage, you stop merely observing and finally feel the positive worth of your own obedience to the law. It's described as a heart being lightened of a heavy burden.
You realize your own inner freedom.
You realize you actually have the power to resist even your strongest, most boisterous, most overwhelming physical inclinations.
And that realization generates profound self-respect. When a person reaches the point where they dread nothing more than finding themselves worthless and contemptible in their own eyes, they have built an impenetrable guard against corrupting motives.
They have achieved true moral independence from the physical world.
Which brings us to the most iconic soaring imagery in this entire philosophy. After meticulously breaking down the mechanics of duty and cultivation, the perspective pulls all the way back to the grandest possible view. It presents the dual infinities.
Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above and the moral law within.
It is a breathtaking synthesis. We are asked to hold these two vast concepts in our minds simultaneously, noting how they both connect directly to the consciousness of our existence, but notice how they pull our sense of self in entirely opposite directions.
The contrast is physically palpable. When you look up at the starry heavens, the external universe, the boundless systems of planets, the limitless expanse of time and space, it effectively annihilates your importance.
It reduces you to a mere animal creature made of matter.
A biological entity that is briefly animated by vital power, only to eventually return its dust to a mere speck of a planet drifting in an infinite void. Physically, under the weight of the cosmos, you are utterly insignificant.
But then you turn your gaze inward. The moral law within infinitely elevates your worth as an intelligence. It reveals a personality, a true infinity that is entirely independent of your animality.
It suggests a destination for your existence that is not restricted to the conditions of this brief physical life, but one that reaches into the infinite.
The physical universe crushes your material importance, but the moral universe elevates your rational worth beyond measure.
It's an awe-inspiring duality, but there is a crucial warning attached to this awe. Admiration and awe are beautiful, but they aren't enough to sustain us. Awe alone doesn't solve practical problems.
No, this dual awe must be connected to the absolute need for a rigorous, methodical science of morals.
Because awe without discipline is incredibly dangerous. Think about early humanity looking up at the starry heavens with raw, unguided awe. Where did it lead? It led to astrology. Superstition, trying to read human destinies in the alignment of stars.
Similarly, when early thinkers contemplated the noble attributes of human morality without a rigorous method, it often led to fanaticism.
True astronomy was only born when physical science adopted rigorous methodology, when scientists started using mathematics and chemistry to study something as simple as the fall of a stone.
By isolating the forces mathematically, they unlocked the unchanging system of the universe.
And the argument here is that we must apply that exact same analytical, methodical precision to human morality. We have to carefully separate the empirical, emotional elements from the pure, rational elements of our judgment.
We must put our common sense through repeated experiments, isolating the pure moral motive from the noise of our inclinations, much like a chemist isolating elements.
Only through that rigorous process can we prevent the errors of crude judgment.
And the dangerous extravagances of unchecked enthusiasm. We have to build a science of morality that is as unchangeable and clear as the orbits of the planets.
It really forces you to grapple with the sheer magnitude of what resides inside your own mind. You possess this internal architecture that reaches into the infinite, demanding a perfection that the physical world simply cannot guarantee.
And as we sit with that reality,
if the moral law within infinitely elevates our worth beyond our physical existence,
right,
how do we actually reconcile this infinite internal worth when we are forced day after day to operate within the rigid, often compromising, terribly limited systems of everyday society?
And that brings us right into the rhythm of this final quiet realization in Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason.
Yeah, it really is. It's a very quiet realization, but a massive one.
Exactly. We are looking at a foundational text in moral philosophy here, a book that has spent hundreds of pages carefully constructing this rigorous framework for how we understand human ethics and the nature of duty.
Right, the nature of duty.
And right here, at the absolute edge of all this monumental work, we step into a thought that feels both incredibly vast and surprisingly pragmatic. The text focuses on this urgent necessity, the need to keep a system from going astray.
Which is such a grounded way to put it.
It is. There's an insistence that philosophy must serve as the eternal guardian of the science. And when we say the science, we are talking about the structured understanding of practical reason and morality. So our mission today, as we explore this book, is to unpack exactly what happens when that guardian goes to sleep, and why Kant believes you, the general public, do not need to read his dense architectural logic to fundamentally rely on it.
It's a compelling space to sit in, especially considering how abstract Kant can be. He is presenting philosophy not as some purely academic exercise confined to university archives, but as an active, vigilant guardian of human ethics.
An active guardian.
Yes, because we have to recognize the sheer weight of what societal morality actually holds up to understand why this guardianship is so necessary. We can frame this by looking at the architectural foundation of a modern skyscraper.
Oh, I like that.
Think about it. When you walk past a skyscraper in a city, you don't see the foundation. You look up and you see the glass, the steel, the people working inside, and it all seems entirely self-sustaining.
It just exists.
Exactly. But buried in the dark, far from the observer's eye, there's an immense calculated structure anchoring that building to the bedrock.
And in Kant's view, that subterranean structure is philosophy. The science of practical reason, the everyday ethics we interact with, is the building above ground where we all live and make our choices. But the bedrock he is drilling into isn't just a vague sense of being good. It is the rigorous deduction of human freedom. Kant argues that if we aren't fundamentally free, then morality simply doesn't exist. So the philosopher's job is to pour the concrete of pure practical reason, ensuring that our ethical systems aren't built on the shifting sand of human emotion.
Or temporary societal trends. And I would take that architectural image a step further. It isn't just a static block of concrete, it is an active distribution of weight. If that invisible foundation were to shift even a fraction of an inch, if it weren't constantly maintained by the absolute principles of logical integrity, the entire skyscraper of human ethics would warp.
The structural integrity would be...
Completely. The floors would slant, the glass would shatter under unequal pressure, and you would face a structural collapse. Philosophy bears the silent weight of our collective moral reasoning. It prevents the building from leaning into the dangerous winds of shifting moods or the corrosive creep of moral compromise.
Let's talk about those dangerous winds, because the text explicitly warns against this science going astray. Why is practical reason in such constant danger of drifting?
Well, because the human experience is turbulent.
It is. We are battered by the appeal of convenience and the complex tides of our own desires, what Kant often calls our inclinations, or our dear self. We have this overwhelming tendency to make exceptions for ourselves.
We do. Just this once, we say.
Exactly. And without a guardian, our ethical reasoning is like a ship caught in a storm with no compass. Philosophy in this framework has to step in as the eternal lighthouse.
It's a striking image, but I would argue Kant's philosophy isn't just a stationary lighthouse warning us of rocks. It's the actual navigational chart the ship relies on.
How so?
Well, a lighthouse doesn't steer the ship, and it certainly doesn't calm the storm of human desires. What it does is provide an absolute, immovable point of reference. In Kantian terms, that light is the a priori principle, a truth that exists independent of our messy, empirical experiences.
Right, independent of what we happen to want in the moment.
Exactly. When we are navigating the fog of a moral dilemma, wondering if it's okay to tell a lie just this once, to save ourselves some trouble, the lighthouse cuts through that fog. It reminds us that a moral law must be universal, regardless of how inconvenient it is for us personally.
So if you, as someone simply navigating the complicated waters of your own life, suddenly found that the fundamental bedrock of right and wrong was no longer illuminated, you would be in serious trouble.
You would drift.
You would. If that light simply went out, practical reason inevitably drifts. It gets pulled by the unseen undercurrents of self-interest or the seductive pull of moral relativism, where any action can be justified if you just twist the context enough.
And we see this historically.
We absolutely do. When societies abandon a rigorous, principled foundation for ethics and replace it with pure utility or state-mandated morality, the ship of societal ethics crashes against the rocks of injustice. The philosophical guardian's job is to prevent that drift. Maintaining the rigorous logic so the science of morality remains true to its course no matter how dark the storm gets.
And maintaining that light requires a level of focus that brings us to the next profound and perhaps slightly uncomfortable observation in the text.
The division of labor.
Yes. Kant acknowledges a fundamental truth about human society when he states that although the public does not take any interest in its subtle investigations, it must take an interest in the resulting doctrines. Now, it is remarkably easy to misinterpret that statement as some sort of elitist criticism of the general public.
Like he is looking down from an ivory tower.
Exactly. But if we look closely at Kant's broader philosophy, it isn't elitist at all. It is a calm, quiet acknowledgement of the necessary division of human labor.
Let's be honest, even philosophers probably don't want to look at Kant's subtle investigations on a Friday night.
Fair point.
To really understand this dynamic, we can compare his dense abstract logic to the hidden intricate gears of a complex pocket watch. If you carefully pry off the brass backing of an antique watch, what you see inside is just overwhelming.
It is incredibly intricate.
Hundreds of microscopic gears, coiled mainsprings, tiny bearings, interlocking levers, all moving with an agonizing precision. The tension is immense, the friction is constant, and the balance required is absolute.
And that microscopic, unforgiving world is the exact equivalent of the subtle investigations Kant is conducting throughout the book. It is the grueling abstract logic. It is the precise categorization of categorical versus hypothetical imperatives, the dialectic of pure practical reason, the synthesis of freedom and moral law.
It's heavy stuff.
Very heavy. These are not concepts you casually skim. They demand a rigorous mental disassembly of how human beings process duty.
And it is entirely natural that you or the broader public avoid the exhausting work of understanding those tiny gears. If you are trying to navigate your day, raise a family, do your job with integrity, and participate in your community, you simply do not have the bandwidth.
Nor should you need to.
Right. You don't have the specialized tools required to study how the escapement wheel of Kantian or priori logic interacts with the palette fork of human free will. It is highly specialized work. Kant is saying the public doesn't take an interest in the subtle investigations because they aren't meant to be clockmakers.
They are meant to live their lives.
Exactly. It's not a flaw in character. It is how a functioning society operates.
We don't demand that every person who drives a car be able to rebuild its transmission from scratch. But we do demand that the mechanics who design the transmission get the engineering right.
Yes, perfectly said.
Kant makes a crucial pivot here. He states that while the public may ignore the gears, it absolutely must take an interest in the resulting doctrines. If the subtle investigations are the hundreds of hidden gears grinding away in the dark, the resulting doctrines are the elegant hands on the face of the watch telling you the time.
You don't need to understand how the mainspring transfers energy to the balance wheel, but you fundamentally rely on that watch to tell you the correct time so you can organize your day.
You trust the face of the watch.
You have to. In the realm of practical reason, the deeply held culturally foundational beliefs about justice, human dignity, and fairness, those are the resulting doctrines. When Kant formulates the idea that we must treat humanity always as an end in itself, and never merely as a means to an end that is a resulting doctrine,
It is a clean, readable output.
generated by hundreds of pages of dense, grinding logical gears.
You rely on it to tell you when to meet your obligations to others. We rely on these resulting doctrines every single day to draft our laws, to write constitutions, and to interact with one another. We don't need the general public to understand the absolute friction of Kant's categorical imperatives grinding in the background. But Kant's point is that someone has to be the watchmaker.
Someone has to guard the mechanism.
Because if the philosopher isn't maintaining the gears, the time is wrong.
And if the time is wrong, the structure of your life fractures. If the philosophical subtle investigation goes astray, perhaps by allowing empirical desires to masquerade as universal duties, the resulting doctrines that society relies on become corrupted.
The output is flawed.
Suddenly, what is considered just or right on the face of society's watch is fundamentally flawed. We start justifying using people as means to an end because it's convenient for the state or profitable for a corporation. So as a participant in humanity, you must care deeply that these resulting doctrines are accurate because they dictate the very safety of your shared reality.
Which forces us to look at how those readable doctrines are actually created. We cannot simply take those clean, elegant rules for granted, assuming they fall from the sky perfectly formed. The text concludes by reminding us that these resulting doctrines are only brought into a clear light through that exact grueling philosophical examination we've been discussing.
The clarity isn't an accident.
Not at all. It is a forged product. And this brings to mind the intense, transformative, almost violent environment of a master blacksmith's forge.
That is a powerful comparison because you don't get a brilliantly clear, polished steel blade by finding it resting gently on the forest floor.
You really don't.
To create a sword that is perfectly balanced and unyielding, you have to subject the raw, rough iron to immense heat. The metal has to be heated until it glows a blinding orange. It has to be pulled from the fire, beaten relentlessly with a heavy hammer folded over itself, cooled, and thrust back into the punishing heat.
It is a physically tolling process to force the impurities out of the metal.
And that intense forge is Kant's philosophical examination.
Yes, the raw, unrefined iron represents our chaotic human experiences, our conflicting moral intuitions, our biases, our situational ethics, what Kant would call our pathological inclinations. Left alone, it is just a heavy, useless lump of ore.
And the intense heat and the relentless hammer blows are the subtle investigations.
Exactly. It's a systematic application of pure reason. Kant is essentially using the categorical imperative as an anvil, testing every human maxim against it. When he strikes the metal, he is hammering out the impurities of self-deception.
The beauty of that forge metaphor is that it illustrates exactly why the immense complexity of Kant's work cannot simply be bypassed. You don't get the polished, razor-sharp blade without the intense heat and the heavy hammering. True, absolute clarity in human morality requires traversing through immense, exhausting complexity first.
The clear light the text mentions that final illumination of the doctrine is the gleam of the finished blade catching the sun.
It's the profound moral truth that anyone can understand and wield in their daily lives.
An idea like universal human rights is a concept as clear and elegant as a masterfully crafted blade. Anyone can grasp its edge, but it only possesses that enduring strength because it survived the grueling forge of philosophical examination.
The guardian philosophy is the master blacksmith, constantly working in the exhausting heat covered in the soot of subtle investigations.
The goal is to ensure that the moral tools the public uses to navigate their lives won't shatter when they are struck against the hard, uncompromising realities of the world.
It is a quiet, monumental undertaking that happens continuously in the background of civilization. The unseen guardians tending the forge, maintaining the subterranean foundation, keeping the lighthouse burning against the fog. It shifts how you view the intellectual labor happening behind the scenes of our legal and ethical systems.
It makes you appreciate the invisible structures we walk on every day.
Which leaves us with a lingering, profound thought for you to reflect on as you go about your day, making countless choices, both small and sweeping. As you navigate the complex architecture of your own life, taking the clear time from the face of the watch, consider what deeply forged doctrines are actually guiding your steps. Take a moment to ask yourself, what are the unseen philosophical foundations that you completely rely on in your own daily decisions? The quiet guardians shaping your sense of right, wrong, and duty, even when the intricate gears beneath the surface remain entirely hidden from view, driving the very next action we take when we finally decide to.